Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I've got a fresh collection of Reddit stories that will keep you company while you tackle that homework. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's dive into tonight's collection. So our first story comes from someone who thought they were planning a nice holiday dinner, only to discover their partner had some very unexpected ideas about guest lists. My partner brought their ex's parents to our holiday dinner. I'm still processing what happened last week, and I honestly don't know if I'm overreacting or if this situation is as bizarre as it feels. My partner Renee and I have been together for about 2 years now, and we decided to host our first holiday dinner together at our apartment. We invited both sets of our parents, my sister and her family, and a few close friends. It was going to be this nice, intimate gathering of maybe 12 people total. Renee was really excited about it, talking for weeks about the menu, the decorations, how we'd arrange the seating. They seemed genuinely happy to be hosting together, and I was looking forward to it too. It felt like a big step for our relationship, you know. The first real holiday we'd celebrate as a couple in our own place. The day of the dinner, I was in the kitchen putting finishing touches on everything when the doorbell rang. I asked Renee to get it since I was dealing with the turkey. I heard voices at the door, but didn't think much of it until Renee called out that our guests had arrived. I walked into the living room, expecting to see my parents, or maybe my sister's family, but instead I found 2 people I'd never met before. An older couple, probably in their 60s, standing there with a bottle of wine and a covered dish. Renee introduced them as Linda and Robert. I was confused because those names weren't on our guest list, and I definitely would have remembered inviting people I'd never heard of. When I asked Renee quietly who they were, they explained that Linda and Robert were their ex-partner's parents. Their ex from before we got together, someone they dated for about 3 years until they broke up 8 months before Renee and I started seeing each other. I was completely taken aback. I asked why they were there, and Renee said they'd run into Linda at the grocery store a few days earlier, and Linda had mentioned how much they missed Renee and how they were going to be alone for the holidays, since their own child was spending it with their new partner's family. Renee thought it would be polite to invite them to our dinner. I tried to stay calm, but I was honestly bewildered. This was supposed to be our holiday dinner, our first one as a couple, with our families and friends. And now we had Renee's ex's parents sitting at our table. Linda and Robert seemed nice enough, but the whole situation felt so awkward and inappropriate. Throughout the dinner, Linda kept bringing up memories of Renee and their ex together, stories about holidays they'd spent together, trips they'd taken, inside jokes from when Renee was practically part of their family. She'd say things like, "Remember when you and Alex went to that cabin with us for New Year's? You two were so cute together." My parents kept looking at me with these confused expressions, and my sister actually pulled me aside at one point to ask what was going on. The worst part was when Linda started showing photos on her phone, pictures of Renee and their ex at family gatherings, at graduations, at Christmas mornings. She was passing the phone around the table like we were all going to enjoy this trip down memory lane. I felt like I was watching my partner's relationship history being celebrated at what was supposed to be our special dinner. Renee didn't seem to understand why I was uncomfortable. When I tried to redirect conversations or change the subject, they'd give me these looks like I was being rude to their guests. At one point, Robert made a toast about how nice it was to see Renee again, and how they'd always considered them part of the family. Everyone raised their glasses awkwardly, and I just sat there feeling like a stranger at my own dinner party. After everyone left, I tried to talk to Renee about how weird the whole evening had been. I explained that having their ex's parents there made me feel uncomfortable and that it seemed inappropriate for our first holiday dinner together. Renee got defensive immediately, saying I was being jealous and possessive over something completely innocent. They argued that Linda and Robert were just nice people who would have been alone for the holidays, and that it was the compassionate thing to do. Renee said I was being petty for not wanting to help people who were lonely, and that my reaction showed I didn't trust them. They made it sound like I was the problem for feeling weird about the situation. I tried to explain that it wasn't about trust or compassion. It was about boundaries and appropriateness. This was our special dinner, our first holiday as a couple, and having their ex's parents there changed the entire dynamic. It made our celebration about their past relationship instead of our current one. But Renee just kept saying I was overreacting and that I needed to get over my insecurities. The argument went on for hours. Renee insisted they'd done nothing wrong and that I was being unreasonable. They said Linda and Robert had been important people in their life for years, and they weren't going to just abandon them because we were together now. I kept trying to explain that I wasn't asking them to abandon anyone, just that there were appropriate times and places for maintaining those relationships, and our intimate holiday dinner wasn't one of them. What really bothered me was that Renee had made this decision unilaterally. They'd invited these people to our dinner without discussing it with me first. They'd changed the entire nature of our celebration without considering how I might feel about it. And when I expressed my discomfort, they dismissed my feelings as jealousy and insecurity. I've been thinking about this for a week now, and I still don't know how to feel. Part of me wonders if I am being too sensitive about it. Maybe it really was just a kind gesture to include people who would have been alone for the holidays. But another part of me feels like this crossed a line, like Renee prioritized their ex's parents' feelings over mine and over the significance of our first holiday together. I keep imagining how I would have felt if the situation were reversed, if I'd invited my ex's parents to our special dinner without telling Renee beforehand. Would they have been okay with that? Would anyone think that was normal and appropriate? I don't think so. The whole thing has made me question how Renee views our relationship and whether they understand the importance of boundaries when it comes to past relationships. It's also made me wonder what other decisions they might make without consulting me, what other people from their past might show up unexpectedly in our future. That story is over. The sheer audacity of inviting your ex's parents to your current partner's first holiday dinner together is honestly mind-blowing. Some people really have no concept of boundaries or how their actions might affect their current relationship. I can't imagine sitting through dinner while someone's ex's mum shows vacation photos from their past relationship. Speaking of people who don't understand boundaries, this next story involves a coworker who thought they could help themselves to someone else's lunch and then blame the cleaning staff when they got caught. My coworker took my lunch and tried to blame the cleaning staff. This happened about 2 weeks ago, and I'm still annoyed about it. I work in a pretty typical office environment with a shared kitchen and refrigerator. Most people bring their lunch from home and store it in the fridge until lunchtime. It's always been an unspoken rule that you don't touch other people's food, but apparently not everyone got that memo. I'd made myself a really nice lunch that morning, leftover homemade lasagna from dinner the night before, packed in a clear container with my name written on masking tape. I also had a small container of garlic bread and a piece of chocolate cake left over from my roommate's birthday party. It was going to be a good lunch, definitely better than the usual sandwich I throw together when I'm running late. I put everything in the fridge around 9 in the morning when I got to work, same as always. The fridge was pretty full, but I found space on the middle shelf and made sure my containers were clearly visible with my name facing outward. I even took a mental note of where I'd placed everything because sometimes things get moved around when people are looking for space. Around noon, I headed to the kitchen to grab my lunch. I was actually looking forward to it because I'd been smelling other people's microwaved food all morning, and it was making me hungry. But when I opened the fridge, my containers weren't where I'd left them. I looked on all the shelves, moved things around, checked the freezer in case someone had accidentally put them there. Nothing. I asked a few co-workers if they'd seen my lunch containers, describing what they looked like. Most people just shrugged and said they hadn't noticed, but one woman mentioned she'd seen someone at the microwave earlier with what looked like lasagna. That got my attention because lasagna isn't exactly common office microwave food. I started looking around for clues, and that's when I noticed something. In the trash can next to Theo's desk, there was a piece of aluminum foil that looked exactly like the foil I'd wrapped my garlic bread in. Same size, same way of folding it. I dug a little deeper in his trash and found the empty container that had held my chocolate cake, along with a plastic fork that definitely came from our kitchen. I was pretty sure at that point that Theo had eaten my lunch, but I wanted to be certain before I accused him of anything. I went back to the kitchen and asked around again, this time specifically asking if anyone had seen Theo with food earlier. The woman who'd mentioned the lasagna confirmed that yes, it had been Theo she'd seen microwaving what looks like a homemade pasta dish. So I went to Theo's desk and asked him directly if he'd seen my lunch. He looked genuinely confused and said no, he hadn't seen anything with my name on it. I told him my containers were missing and that I'd found what looked like my trash in his garbage can. That's when he got defensive and started acting like I was accusing him of something terrible. Theo said he'd brought his own lunch from home, just like he always did. He claimed he'd had leftover lasagna from his girlfriend's cooking and that the containers in his trash were from his own food. When I pointed out that the cake container was the same brand I'd used and that I could literally see my name written on the bottom of it in the trash, he got more agitated. That's when he came up with the cleaning staff story. Theo said that maybe the cleaning crew had thrown out my lunch by mistake when they were cleaning the fridge. He suggested that sometimes they cleared out old food and that my containers might have gotten mixed up with expired items. He said he'd seen them cleaning the kitchen earlier that morning and that they probably just made an honest mistake. The problem with his story was that I'd literally put my lunch in the fridge that same morning, and the cleaning staff comes in the evening, not during work hours. Also, the containers in his trash weren't just empty, they were clean. If the cleaning staff had thrown them out, they wouldn't have been licked clean and then carefully disposed of in Theo's personal desk trash can. I called him out on the inconsistencies in his story, and that's when he really doubled down. He started acting indignant, saying I was being paranoid and that he couldn't believe I was accusing him of stealing food. He raised his voice enough that other people started looking over, and he made a big show of being offended by my accusations. Theo insisted that his girlfriend had made him lasagna the night before, that he'd brought his own garlic bread, and that he'd gotten the cake from the vending machine. But when I asked why all of his supposed homemade food containers ended up in his trash instead of being taken home for reuse like most people do, he couldn't give me a good answer. The final nail in the coffin was when I asked him to show me the receipt for the vending machine cake. Our office vending machine doesn't sell individual slices of chocolate cake, just packaged snacks and candy bars. He realised he'd been caught in the lie and started backtracking, saying maybe he'd bought the cake from the cafe downstairs. At that point, I'd had enough. I told Theo I knew he'd eaten my lunch and that I didn't appreciate being lied to about it. I said if he'd been hungry and needed food, he could have asked me or anyone else, and we probably would have shared. But stealing someone's lunch and then making up elaborate stories about cleaning staff throwing it away was just pathetic. Theo never admitted to taking my food, but he stopped trying to blame the cleaning staff. He just kept saying it was all a misunderstanding and that these things happen in busy offices. He offered to buy me lunch from the cafe downstairs to make up for the confusion, which was basically an admission of guilt without actually saying the words. I accepted his offer to buy me lunch, but I've been keeping my food in a mini cooler at my desk ever since. I also made sure to mention the incident to a few other co-workers, not to be vindictive, but because if Theo was willing to steal my lunch and lie about it, he'd probably do it to other people too. The whole thing was just so unnecessary. If he'd been hungry and forgotten his lunch, any of us would have shared our food with him. Instead, he chose to steal, lie, and try to blame innocent cleaning staff for his own behaviour. It's made me look at him completely differently, and I don't trust him the same way I used to. That story is over. The mental gymnastics required to blame the cleaning staff for your own food theft is truly impressive. Imagine being so caught red-handed that you still try to maintain your innocence while offering to buy replacement lunch. Some people really will double down on a lie, even when the evidence is literally sitting in their trash can. Our next story takes us into family drama territory, where one sister decided that imitation isn't the sincerest form of flattery. It's just plain creepy. My sister tried to copy my tattoo. This happened about a month ago, and I'm still trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I'm 25, and my sister Mira is 23. We've always had a complicated relationship, but this latest incident has really pushed things to a new level of weird. About 6 months ago, I got my first tattoo. It was something I'd been planning for over a year, researching artists, refining the design, and saving up money to get it done properly. The tattoo is a pretty intricate floral design that wraps around my forearm, incorporating flowers that have special meaning to me. Each flower represents a different important person or moment in my life, and I worked with the artist to create something completely unique. And the tattoo is on my left forearm, and it includes my grandmother's favourite roses, the wildflowers from the field where I had my first kiss, and some abstract elements that represent my journey through college. It took about 4 hours to complete, and I absolutely love how it turned out. I've gotten so many compliments on it, and it feels like a perfect representation of who I am and what matters to me. Mira saw the tattoo when I visited our parents a few weeks after getting it done. She seemed really interested, asking lots of questions about the process, how much it hurt, what the different elements meant. I was happy to talk about it because I was still in that excited phase where I wanted to show everyone. She took several photos of it from different angles, which I thought was just normal sibling curiosity. About 2 weeks after that visit, Mira posted on social media that she was getting her first tattoo. She'd found an artist in her city and was really excited about the design. She didn't share any details about what she was getting, just said it was going to be something meaningful and personal. I thought it was cool that my tattoo had inspired her to finally take the plunge on something she'd been considering. At the day of her appointment, she posted a few stories on Instagram from the tattoo parlour, but kept the actual design hidden. She was being all mysterious about it, saying people would have to wait to see the final result. I figured she was just building up suspense like people do with big life events. Then she posted the reveal photo and my heart just sank. It was my tattoo. Not similar to my tattoo, not inspired by my tattoo, but an exact replica of my tattoo. Same placement, same size, same flowers, same abstract elements, same everything. She'd literally taken the photos she'd snapped at our parents' house to a tattoo artist and asked them to copy it exactly. I stared at the photo for probably 10 minutes, trying to convince myself I was seeing things, but there was no mistaking it. Every single detail was identical, down to the way the roses connected to the wildflowers and the specific shading techniques the artist had used. It was like looking at a mirror image of my own arm. I called Mira immediately, and she answered like nothing was wrong. She was so excited, talking about how much she loved her new tattoo and how great the artist was. When I asked her why she'd copied my design exactly, she acted like I was being dramatic. She said she'd been inspired by mine and decided to get something similar. I told her it wasn't similar. It was identical. She'd copied every single element without changing anything or making it her own in any way. Mira got defensive and said that tattoo designs aren't copyrighted, that people get similar tattoos all the time, and that I was overreacting to something that should be flattering. I tried to explain that this wasn't about copyright or legality. It was about the fact that I'd spent months designing something personal and meaningful, and she'd just taken it without even asking. The flowers in my tattoo represent specific people and moments in my life. What did they represent in hers? She couldn't give me an answer beyond saying she liked how they looked. Mira said she'd always admired my style and wanted something that would make us feel more connected as sisters. She thought it would be sweet if we had matching tattoos, like a bonding thing. But she'd never mentioned wanting matching tattoos before, and she'd gone about it in the most inconsiderate way possible. The conversation got more heated when I pointed out that she could have asked me if I wanted to design something together, or if I'd be okay with her using elements from my tattoo in her own design. Instead, she'd gone behind my back and copied it exactly, then acted surprised when I was upset about it. She kept insisting that I was being selfish and possessive over something that was just art. She said I didn't own the concept of roses and wildflowers, and that lots of people have similar tattoos. But this wasn't about the general concept of floral tattoos. This was about her copying my specific, personalized design without permission or consideration. The worst part was when she started posting photos of both of our tattoos side by side, talking about how cute it was, that we had matching ink, and how it represented our sisterly bond. People were commenting about how sweet it was, and she was eating up all the attention. It felt like she was taking credit for something that was entirely my idea and my creative process. I asked her to take down the posts comparing our tattoos, and she refused. She said she was proud of her tattoo and had every right to share photos of it. She accused me of trying to control her social media and said I was being jealous that people were giving her positive attention. Our parents got involved when they saw the posts and realised what had happened. They were honestly shocked that Mira had copied my design so exactly. Our mum called me to ask if I'd been okay with it. And when I explained the situation, she agreed that it was inappropriate. But when they talked to Mira about it, she just repeated her arguments about inspiration and sisterly bonding. The whole thing has created this weird dynamic where every time we're together, people notice our matching tattoos and comment on them. They think it's this planned sweet gesture between sisters, but for me it just feels like a constant reminder that Mira couldn't be bothered to create something original for herself. I've been avoiding family gatherings where both of us will be present because I don't want to deal with the comments and explanations. It's also made me really self-conscious about my tattoo. Something that used to make me feel unique and confident now feels like half of a matching set that I never agreed to be part of. Mira still doesn't understand why I'm upset. She thinks I should be flattered that she liked my design enough to get it permanently inked on her body. But she doesn't seem to grasp that taking someone's personal, meaningful artwork without permission isn't flattering. It's selfish and inconsiderate. That story's over. The complete lack of originality is one thing. But posting side-by-side photos like it was some planned sister bonding moment is next-level delusional. Some people really think imitation is flattery, when it's actually just theft with a needle. Let's move on to a birthday story that'll make you want to keep your celebration plans to yourself from now on. My friend turned my birthday dinner into their own celebration. Last month was my birthday, and I'd been planning a nice dinner with close friends for weeks. Nothing too elaborate, just a reservation at my favourite restaurant with about 8 people I really care about. I'd been looking forward to it for months because it's been a really difficult year for me, and I wanted to do something special to mark turning 27. My friend Elias was one of the first people I invited. We've been close for about 3 years now, and they're usually really good about celebrating important occasions. They seemed excited about the dinner, and even offered to help coordinate getting everyone there on time. I thought it was sweet that they wanted to be involved in making my birthday special. The night of the dinner, I got to the restaurant a little early to make sure everything was set up properly. I'd requested a specific table that could accommodate our group comfortably, and I wanted to double-check that the staff knew it was a birthday celebration. When Elias arrived, they were carrying a large bag and seemed unusually energetic, even for them. I didn't think much of the bag at first. People bring gifts to birthday dinners. That's normal. But when the rest of our friends started arriving and we were all seated, Elias suddenly stood up and pulled out decorations from their bag. Not just any decorations, but balloons, streamers, and a small banner that read, "Happy Half Birthday," in glittery letters. Before I could process what was happening, Elias started hanging the banner behind their chair and distributing balloons around their section of the table. They announced to everyone that today marked exactly 6 months since their birthday, making it their half birthday, and they wanted to celebrate this milestone with all their favourite people. The entire table went quiet. Everyone was looking back and forth between me and Elias, trying to figure out what was happening. Here we were, gathered specifically for my birthday dinner, and Elias was literally decorating the space for for their own celebration. They'd brought their own party supplies to my party. I tried to laugh it off at first, thinking maybe it was some kind of joke, or that they were planning to transition into birthday wishes for me. But Elias kept going. They started passing around party hats, but only for their half-birthday theme. They'd brought a small cake that said, "Happy 6 months," and began cutting slices for everyone. When the server came over to ask about drinks, Elias jumped in and said we were celebrating their half-birthday, and asked if the restaurant did anything special for half-birthday celebrations. The server looked completely confused and glanced at me, clearly remembering that I'd made the reservation and mentioned it was for my birthday. I finally spoke up and reminded Elias that we were there for my actual birthday, not their half-birthday. They looked at me like I was being unreasonable and said there was no reason we couldn't celebrate both occasions together. They suggested we could share the spotlight and make it a double celebration, but it wasn't a double celebration. Elias had completely taken over the evening. They were the one making toasts, they were the centre of attention, and they'd literally brought their own cake when I'd specifically told everyone I was handling dessert. My birthday cake was sitting in a box by my chair, completely overshadowed by their half-birthday production. The rest of my friends were trying to be polite, but I could see how uncomfortable everyone was. Some people were going along with Elias's half-birthday theme because they didn't want to cause drama, but others were shooting me apologetic looks and trying to redirect attention back to my actual birthday. When it came time for gift giving, Elias went first and presented me with their gift, which was nice, but then they announced that since it was also their special day, they'd love to receive some half-birthday wishes or small tokens of appreciation from everyone. They actually suggested that people could share their birthday gifts with them since they were celebrating together. That's when I'd had enough. I told Elias that I appreciated their enthusiasm, but this was specifically my birthday dinner that I'd planned and paid for. If they wanted to celebrate their half-birthday, they could organise their own gathering. I said it wasn't appropriate to hijack someone else's celebration for their own purposes. Elias got defensive immediately. They said they were just trying to make the evening more fun and festive, and that I was being selfish for not wanting to share my special day. They claimed that half-birthdays were just as important as regular birthdays and deserved recognition too. The argument continued for several minutes, while my other friends sat there awkwardly. Elias kept insisting that there was enough celebration to go around, and that I was being possessive over something that should be joyful and inclusive. They made it sound like I was the problem for not embracing their spontaneous party edition. Eventually, Elias packed up their decorations in a huff and left the restaurant, taking their half-birthday cake with them. They made a big show of saying goodbye to everyone and thanking them for being supportive of their celebration, even though most people had barely participated. After they left, the dinner got back on track, but the whole evening felt tainted. My friends were apologetic and tried to make the rest of the night about me, but we'd lost so much time and energy dealing with Elias's drama that it was hard to recapture the celebratory mood I'd been hoping for. What bothered me most wasn't just that they'd crashed my party, but that they'd planned it in advance. They'd brought decorations, a cake, party hats, all of it. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of wanting to celebrate. They deliberately decided to use my birthday dinner as the venue for their own celebration. When I talked to other friends about it later, they all agreed that Elias's behaviour was completely inappropriate. One friend mentioned that they'd seemed disappointed when they realised the evening was actually going to be focused on me, like they'd expected or hoped it would become about them instead. Elias sent me a text the next day saying they were sorry if I felt like they'd overstepped, but they still maintained that celebrating multiple occasions together could have been fun if I'd been more open-minded about it. They never actually acknowledged that what they'd done was wrong, just that I'd reacted poorly to their attempt to enhance the celebration. That story's over. Imagine planning your own surprise half-birthday party at someone else's actual birthday dinner and then getting mad when they don't want to share the spotlight. The premeditation makes it so much worse than if it had been a spontaneous moment of attention-seeking. This next story comes from someone who learned that finishing your work on time apparently makes you lazy in some managers' eyes. My boss called me lazy for leaving on time. I work at a marketing firm where my official hours are 9 to 5:30 Monday through Friday. It's clearly stated in my employment contract, and it's what I agreed to when I accepted the position 8 months ago. My boss Owen has always seemed reasonable about work-life balance, at least during the interview process and my first few months on the job. I've always been pretty efficient with my work. I get to the office right at 9, I don't take long lunches, and I stay focused during the day instead of spending time on social media or personal calls. Because of this, I'm usually able to finish my assigned tasks and projects by the end of my scheduled workday. When 5:30 rolls around, I pack up my things and head home, just like my contract says I can. This arrangement worked fine for months. Owen never complained about my work quality. I met all my deadlines, and my performance reviews were positive. I thought I was doing exactly what was expected of me. I was delivering good work within my assigned hours and maintaining a healthy balance between my job and personal life. About a month ago, things started changing. Owen began making comments when he'd see me packing up to leave at 5:30. Little remarks like, "Heading out already?" or "Must be nice to have such a predictable schedule." I thought he was just making conversation at first, but the tone started becoming more pointed. Then he started scheduling last-minute meetings or bringing up new projects right around 5:25. He'd walk over to my desk at 5:28 and say things like, "Before you go, can we quickly discuss this campaign?" Or, "I know you're probably eager to leave, but this client's issue just came up." It felt like he was testing whether I'd stay late or push back on leaving on time. I tried to be accommodating when these situations came up. If something was genuinely urgent, I'd stay an extra 15 or 20 minutes to handle it. But I also started pointing out that if he needed to discuss projects or issues, it would be better to bring them up earlier in the day when I had more time to address them properly. The situation came to a head 2 weeks ago when Owen called me into his office at the end of the day. He sat me down and told me he'd been observing my work habits and had some concerns about my commitment to the team. He said that while my work quality was fine, my attitude toward the job seemed lacking. When I asked what he meant, Owen explained that he'd noticed I never stayed late voluntarily, never came in early to get ahead on projects, and always seemed eager to leave exactly when my shift ended. He said that in his experience, employees who were really invested in their careers and their company's success were willing to go above and beyond the minimum requirements. I was honestly shocked. I told him that I completed all my assigned work, met every deadline, and produced quality results within my contracted hours. I asked what more he expected from me, and that's when he used the word that really got to me. He said that real employees, the ones who advance in their careers, don't watch the clock like lazy workers do. Lazy. He called me lazy for working my contracted hours and leaving on time. I reminded him that my employment agreement specifically states my working hours, and that I was fulfilling exactly what I'd been hired to do. I pointed out that staying late doesn't necessarily mean someone is working harder or producing better results, just that they're less efficient during regular hours. Owen dismissed my arguments and said that company culture was about more than just contract terms. He explained that the most successful people in the industry were the ones who treated their job as more than just a paycheck, who were willing to sacrifice some personal time to really excel at their work. He started giving me examples of other employees who regularly stayed until 7 or 8 o'clock, who came in on weekends to catch up on projects, who were always available for client calls even outside business hours. He said these were the people who got promoted, who got raises, who built real careers in marketing. I asked if he was unsatisfied with my work output or quality, and he admitted that he wasn't. My projects were completed on time and met the company's standards, but he said it was about the message I was sending to the team and to clients. When people see someone leaving exactly at 5:30 every day, it suggests they're not fully committed to their role. The conversation continued for almost an hour, with Owen basically trying to convince me that I needed to change my approach to work if I wanted to be successful at the company. He suggested I start staying late at least a few nights a week, even if I didn't have urgent tasks to complete. He said it would show initiative and dedication. I left that meeting feeling frustrated and confused. I'd been doing good work within my assigned hours, but apparently that wasn't enough. Owen wanted me to perform dedication by staying late, regardless of whether there was actual work to be done. It felt like he was asking me to waste time just to create the appearance of being a hard worker. The next few days were awkward. Owen would make pointed comments when I'd leave on time, saying things like, "Off to your evening plans," or "See you tomorrow, bright and early, I'm sure." It felt like he was trying to shame me for maintaining work-life boundaries. I started documenting everything. I kept track of all the projects I completed, the deadlines I met, and the hours I worked. I wanted to have concrete evidence that I was fulfilling my job requirements in case Owen tried to use my punctual departure times against me in a performance review. Last week, I decided to have another conversation with Owen about expectations. I brought my documentation and asked him to specify exactly what additional tasks or responsibilities he wanted me to take on. If he needed me to work longer hours, I said, then we should discuss adjusting my salary or my official job description to reflect those expectations. Owen seemed caught off guard by my direct approach. He couldn't point to any specific work that wasn't getting done, or any particular areas where my performance was lacking. When pressed for details about what he wanted me to do during these extra hours, he just said I should find ways to go above and beyond my current responsibilities. The whole situation has made me question whether this is the right company for me. If leaving on time after completing my work makes me lazy in Owen's eyes, then we have fundamentally different ideas about what constitutes good work performance. I'm starting to look for other opportunities where efficiency is valued over face time. That story is over. Some managers really think that looking busy is more important than being productive. The idea that you're lazy for completing your work efficiently within business hours is such backwards thinking, it's almost impressive. Our next story involves a cousin who decided that being first to the promposal was more important than basic family loyalty. My cousin stole my promposal idea and used it before I could. I'm 18 and a senior in high school. Prom is coming up in about 6 weeks, and I've been planning this elaborate promposal for my girlfriend Zoe for over a month. I wanted to make it really special, because this is both of our first prom, and she's been excited about it since the beginning of the school year. My idea was to recreate the scene from her favourite movie, The Princess Bride. Zoe is obsessed with that film and quotes it constantly. I was going to dress up as Wesley, complete with the black mask and everything, and show up at her house with a dozen red roses. I'd planned to get down on one knee in her front yard and say the whole "as you wish" line before asking her to prom with a custom poster that had quotes from the movie. I'd been working on this plan for weeks, ordering the costume pieces online, designing the poster, coordinating with her parents to make sure they'd be home to witness it. I even practiced the lines in front of my mirror so I wouldn't mess up when the moment came. I was planning to do it this upcoming Saturday afternoon. The problem is my cousin Juliet. She's also a senior, but at a different school across town. We've always been competitive with each other, even as kids. If I got a good grade, she had to get a better one. If I joined a sport, she'd find a way to excel at it too. Our families joke about it, but it's honestly exhausting sometimes. Last weekend, we were both at our grandmother's house for Sunday dinner. The whole extended family was there, and people were talking about prom season. My aunt asked if Juliet had been asked to prom yet, and she said no, but that she was hoping this guy, Trevor, from her chemistry class, would ask her soon. I mentioned that I was planning to ask Zoe in a really special way, and everyone wanted to hear about it. I was excited to share my idea, so I told them all about the Princess Bride theme, the costume, the roses, everything. My family thought it was adorable and romantic. They were all giving me compliments about how creative and thoughtful I was being. Juliet seemed really interested in the details. She asked a lot of questions about where I'd gotten the costume, how I'd designed the poster, what exactly I was planning to say. I thought she was just being supportive and maybe getting ideas for when Trevor asked her to prom, or for when she might want to ask someone herself. This past Tuesday, I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw a post that made my stomach drop. It was Juliet, dressed as Buttercup from The Princess Bride, standing next to Trevor, who was dressed exactly like my Wesley costume. Same black outfit, same mask, same everything. The caption read, "He said as you wish, and I said yes to prom," with a bunch of heart emojis. I clicked through to see more photos, and it was literally my entire idea. Trevor was kneeling in front of Juliet's house with red roses, holding a poster covered in Princess Bride quotes. The setup, the costumes, the props, even the pose was exactly what I'd described at family dinner. She'd taken my entire concept and convinced Trevor to use it for his proposal to her. I was furious. I immediately called Juliet and asked what the hell she thought she was doing. She acted like she didn't understand why I was upset. She said that The Princess Bride was a popular movie and that lots of people probably used it for proposals. She claimed it was just a coincidence that Trevor had come up with the same idea, but it wasn't a coincidence. The details were too specific, too identical to what I'd planned. She even had him use the exact same quotes I'd mentioned putting on my poster. When I pointed this out, she got defensive and said that those were just the most obvious quotes from the movie to use. I told her she'd stolen my idea and ruined my proposal for Zoe. Now if I went through with my original plan, it would look like I was copying her, even though I'd had the idea first. Juliet said I was being dramatic and that I didn't own the concept of Princess Bride proposals. She suggested that I could just come up with a different idea for Zoe, that there were plenty of other movies or themes I could use. She said it wasn't her fault that Trevor had thought of the same thing I did, and that I couldn't expect her to turn down a proposal just because it was similar to something I was planning. The worst part was seeing all the social media attention she was getting for her creative proposal idea. People were commenting about how original and romantic it was, sharing the photos, talking about how perfect they looked together. She was basking in all the praise for something that was entirely my concept. When I tried to explain the situation to a few of my friends, some of them suggested that maybe it really was just a coincidence. They said that The Princess Bride was popular enough that multiple people could think of using it for proposals, but I know that's not what happened. The execution was too identical to be independent inspiration. I ended up having to completely scrap my original plan and come up with something else for Zoe. I managed to put together a different proposal based on her love of astronomy, and she said yes, but it felt rushed and less meaningful than what I'd originally planned. I kept thinking about how perfect the Princess Bride idea would have been, and how much time and effort I'd put into planning it. The family drama continued when other relatives saw Juliet's posts and started commenting about how it was the same idea I described at dinner. Some of them called her out on it, which made things even more awkward. Juliet got mad at me for turning the family against her, even though I hadn't said anything to them about it. My grandmother tried to smooth things over by saying that both proposals were lovely and that it didn't matter who did what first, but it did matter to me. I'd put weeks of thought and planning into something special for my girlfriend, and Juliet had stolen it and claimed it as her own. The worst part is that Juliet still won't admit what she did. She maintains that it was all Trevor's idea and that any similarities to my plan were pure coincidence. She's never apologised or acknowledged that her actions affected me at all. That story is over. The level of family betrayal here is just staggering. Imagine hearing someone's detailed proposal plans at Sunday dinner and then rushing to execute them before the person who thought them up. Some people really have no shame when it comes to stealing credit for other people's creativity. Moving on to a concert story that'll make you think twice about going to shows with unreliable partners. My partner left me alone at a concert because they wanted to be closer to the stage. This happened about 3 weeks ago, and I'm still processing how selfish and inconsiderate the whole situation was. My partner Jonah and I had been looking forward to this concert for months. It was one of our favourite bands, and we'd bought tickets as soon as they went on sale back in February. The venue was this massive outdoor amphitheatre about 2 hours from where we live. We'd made a whole day of it, booking a hotel room nearby so we wouldn't have to drive back late at night. Jonah had been talking about this show constantly, sharing videos of the band's recent performances, discussing which songs they hoped would be on the set list. We got to the venue around 6 in the evening, even though the show wasn't starting until 8. Jonah wanted to grab dinner at one of the food trucks and walk around the area before finding our seats. Our tickets were for the lawn section, which is general admission seating on a hill behind the covered pavilion. Not the closest seats to the stage, but decent enough for the price we'd paid. When we first arrived at our spot on the lawn, Jonah seemed happy with the view. We spread out our blanket, got comfortable, and were enjoying the opening acts. The atmosphere was great, everyone around us was friendly, and I was really looking forward to hearing our favourite songs performed live. But as the evening went on, Jonah kept standing up and looking toward the stage area. They started making comments about how much better the view would be from the pavilion section, how the sound quality was probably superior closer to the stage, how the lawn seats were really more for people who didn't care as much about the music. I reminded them that we'd chosen lawn tickets because they were what we could afford, and that we had a perfectly good view from where we were. The band wasn't even on stage yet, so we hadn't experienced the actual show from our seats, but Jonah seemed increasingly restless and dissatisfied with our location. When the main act finally came on stage, the energy was incredible. Everyone on the lawn was on their feet, singing along, having an amazing time. The band sounded fantastic, and I was completely caught up in the performance. But I noticed Jonah wasn't really engaging with the music. They kept looking around, watching other people, seeming distracted. About halfway through the second song, Jonah leaned over and shouted in my ear that they were going to try to get closer to the stage. They said they'd spotted some open space in the pavilion section and wanted to move up there for a better experience. I shouted back that I was happy where we were and didn't want to abandon our spot. That's when Jonah said something that should have been a red flag. They told me I could stay on the lawn if I wanted, but they were going to go enjoy the show from a better location. They said they'd meet me back at this spot when the concert was over, and then they just walked away. I stood there for a moment, not quite believing what had just happened. We'd come to this concert together, planned it as a shared experience, and now Jonah had just abandoned me to go have their own better time somewhere else. I looked around at all the couples and groups of friends enjoying the show together, and suddenly felt completely alone. I tried to keep enjoying the music, but I was distracted and hurt. Every few songs, I'd look toward the pavilion section, trying to spot Jonah in the crowd. I could see the area they'd been heading toward, but there were so many people that it was impossible to pick them out specifically. The worst part was feeling like I couldn't fully enjoy the concert because I was worried about logistics. How are we going to find each other afterward? What if they decided to leave early? What if something happened and I couldn't reach them? We'd driven there together, so I was dependent on them for transportation back to our hotel. As the show went on, I started feeling more and more resentful. This was supposed to be our special night together, something we'd both been looking forward to for months. Instead, Jonah had decided that their personal enjoyment was more important than sharing the experience with me. When the concert ended and the lights came up, I waited at our original spot on the lawn for Jonah to return. I watched as couples and groups of friends gathered their things together, talking excitedly about the songs they'd just heard. Everyone else seemed to have shared the experience with the people they'd come with. I waited for almost 30 minutes before Jonah finally appeared, looking sweaty and energized from being in the thick of the crowd. They were talking enthusiastically about how incredible the show had been from up close, how they'd been able to see the band members' facial expressions, how the energy was so much more intense in the pavilion. When I asked why they hadn't come back to get me or tried to bring me with them, Jonah said they'd been worried about losing their spot if they left to find me. They said the pavilion area had been really crowded and competitive, and they hadn't wanted to risk missing out on the experience. I told them I felt abandoned and hurt, that they'd prioritised their own concert experience over spending the evening together. Jonah seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. They said they'd thought I would be fine on the lawn, that I'd seemed comfortable there, and that they'd just wanted to make the most of the show. They couldn't understand why I was upset about them trying to get a better view. In their mind, they'd found a way to enhance their concert experience, and I could have done the same if I'd wanted to. They said it wasn't their job to limit their own enjoyment just because I preferred to stay in our original seats. The ride back to the hotel was tense and quiet. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the seats or the view. It was about the fact that we'd planned this as a shared experience, and they'd abandoned that plan without considering how it would affect me. But Jonah maintained that they hadn't done anything wrong. They said that at concerts people move around all the time, that it's normal for individuals to try to get better spots, and that I was being too sensitive about something that didn't really matter. They couldn't see why their decision to move closer to the stage was a relationship issue rather than just a personal preference. The whole experience left me feeling like Jonah and I have very different ideas about what it means to attend events together. To me, the point of going to a concert with your partner is to share that experience, to be together during the special moments. But to Jonah, it seemed like we were just two individuals who happened to arrive at the same venue together. That story's over. Nothing says romance like ditching your partner at a concert so you can have a better time without them. The complete lack of consideration for how that would feel is just mind-blowing. Some people really think relationships are just convenient transportation arrangements. Let's move to a workplace story about someone who thought they could improve other people's presentations without permission. My coworker tried to change my presentation slides without asking. This happened during a big client meeting last week, and I'm still trying to figure out how to handle the aftermath. I work at a consulting firm, and we were presenting a quarterly review to one of our most important clients. I'd been working on this presentation for over 2 weeks, researching data, creating charts, and crafting talking points that would clearly communicate our team's progress. My coworker Kai was also part of the presentation team, but their role was supposed to be focused on the technical implementation details, while I handled the strategic overview and results analysis. We divided up the responsibilities clearly during our planning meetings, and everyone seemed comfortable with their assigned sections. The night before the presentation, I sent the final version of my slides to our team leader and copied Kai on the email. I'd spent the entire previous day polishing everything, making sure the data visualizations were clear, and rehearsing my talking points. I felt confident about the content and was looking forward to presenting our team's successes to the client. I arrived at the office early the morning of the presentation to do one final review of my materials. When I opened the presentation file to practice my sections, I immediately noticed that something was different. Several of my slides had been completely redesigned with new layouts, different colour schemes, and reorganised information. At first I thought maybe I'd opened the wrong file or that there had been some kind of software glitch. But when I looked more closely, I could see that someone had deliberately modified my work. Charts I'd spent hours perfecting were now formatted differently. Text I'd carefully crafted was rearranged or reworded. Even my slide transitions had been changed. I checked the file properties and saw that Kai had accessed and modified the presentation at 11:30 the night before, well after I'd sent what I thought was the final version. They'd made extensive changes to my sections without asking for my input or even letting me know they were planning to edit my work. I immediately walked over to Kai's desk to ask what had happened. They were already at their computer, seemingly preparing for the presentation. When I asked about the changes to my slides, Kai looked up casually and said they'd noticed some areas that could be improved, so they'd taken the liberty of making the presentation look more professional. I was stunned. I asked what specifically had been wrong with my original slides that required such extensive modifications. Kai explained that they thought the colour scheme was too bland, that some of my charts would be clearer with different formatting, and that the overall flow could be enhanced with better transitions between sections. When I pointed out that they'd changed content as well as formatting, Kai said they'd just cleaned up some of the language to make it more concise and impactful. They seemed to think they were doing me a favour by improving my work and couldn't understand why I seemed upset about their helpful edits. I told Kai that I needed to review all the changes before the presentation, which was starting in less than 2 hours. Some of their modifications had altered the meaning of my data points or changed the emphasis of my conclusions. I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to present information confidently if I wasn't familiar with how it had been reorganized. Kai waved off my concerns and said the changes were all improvements that would make the presentation stronger. They suggested I should be grateful that someone had taken the time to enhance my work rather than worrying about minor adjustments to formatting and wording. But these weren't minor adjustments. Kai had fundamentally changed the structure of several slides, moved information between sections, and altered the narrative flow I'd carefully constructed. They'd turned my data-driven analysis into something that looked flashier but was actually less clear and harder to follow. The most problematic change was to my conclusion slide, where I'd summarised our team's key achievements and recommendations for the next quarter. Kai had restructured this summary to emphasise different points and had added recommendations that we hadn't discussed as a team. They'd essentially put words in my mouth that I wasn't prepared to defend during client questions. I spent the next hour frantically trying to familiarise myself with Kai's changes and figuring out how to present information that no longer matched my prepared talking points. Some of their formatting modifications had made charts harder to read, and their text changes had introduced subtle inaccuracies that I was worried the client might notice. When our team leader arrived and saw me scrambling to understand my own presentation, they asked what was going on. I explained that Kai had made extensive changes to my sections without consultation, and that I was trying to adapt my presentation style to match their modifications. Our team leader was not happy. They pointed out that we'd already approved the final version of the presentation, and that making last-minute changes without team consensus was inappropriate, especially for such an important client meeting. They asked Kai to explain their reasoning for modifying my work. Kai maintained that they were just trying to help improve the overall quality of our presentation. They said they had experience with visual design and thought their changes would make a better impression on the client. They seemed genuinely confused about why their initiative was being treated as a problem rather than a contribution. The presentation itself went reasonably well, but I felt off balance throughout my sections. I had to improvise explanations for charts that no longer looked the way I'd practiced describing them, and I stumbled over text that didn't match the flow I'd rehearsed. The client didn't seem to notice, but I knew my delivery wasn't as polished as it should have been. After the meeting, our team leader pulled both Kai and me aside for a debrief. They made it clear that collaborative work requires communication and consensus, and that making unilateral changes to colleagues' materials is not acceptable, regardless of the intentions behind it. Kai apologised, but it felt more like they were sorry for getting in trouble than sorry for disrupting my preparation and undermining my confidence in my own work. They still seemed to believe that their changes had improved the presentation, even though they'd made my job much harder. That story is over. The complete disregard for professional boundaries here is astounding. Imagine staying up late to secretly redesign someone else's presentation and then acting like you did them a favour. Some people really think their unsolicited help is more valuable than basic respect and communication. Our next story involves a friend who has never learned the difference between being invited somewhere and inviting yourself. My friend always invites themselves to my family events, and I don't know how to make it stop. My friend Selene and I have been close for about 4 years now. We met in college and stayed in touch after graduation, and she's generally a good person who I enjoy spending time with. But she has this habit that's becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and I don't know how to address it without hurting her feelings or damaging our friendship. It started small and seemed harmless at first. About 2 years ago, I mentioned that I was going to my cousin's graduation party that weekend. I was talking about it casually, the way you do when you're making conversation about your weekend plans. Celine immediately said that sounded fun and asked what time it started. Before I realised what was happening, she'd essentially invited herself along. I felt awkward saying no, especially since she seemed genuinely excited about meeting my extended family and celebrating my cousin's achievement. I figured it would be fine for one event, and my family is generally welcoming to friends. So I told her she was welcome to come, and she had a great time at the party. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few months, every time I mentioned a family gathering or celebration, Celine would express interest in attending. Birthday dinners, holiday parties, baby showers, graduation celebrations. She wanted to be included in all of them, and she never waited for an invitation. She would just assume she was welcome and start making plans to attend. At first, my family thought it was sweet that I had such a close friend who wanted to be part of our gatherings. They welcomed her warmly and made sure she felt included in conversations and activities. Celine is charming and social, so she fit in well with my relatives and always contributed to the positive atmosphere of our events. But as time went on, it started feeling strange to have her at every single family function. These were supposed to be intimate gatherings for relatives and close family friends, but Celine had essentially made herself a permanent fixture at all of them. She knew my family's inside jokes, remembered details about my cousins' relationships, and had opinions about family drama that she'd overheard at previous events. The situation became more complicated when Selena started bringing gifts and contributing to event planning. She'd ask my mum what she could bring to holiday dinners, offer to help set up for parties, and even started sending birthday cards to my relatives. On one hand, this was thoughtful and generous. On the other hand, it felt like she was inserting herself into family relationships that weren't really hers to claim. The breaking point came last month at my grandmother's 80th birthday party. This was a really special celebration that my family had been planning for weeks. We'd rented a private room at my grandmother's favourite restaurant, and it was meant to be just immediate family and a few of her oldest friends. About 20 people total, all of whom had deep, long-standing relationships with my grandmother. I'd mentioned the party to Celine in passing, the same way I might mention any weekend plan. I wasn't thinking about it as an invitation opportunity because it felt like such an obviously intimate family event. But sure enough, Celine asked about the details and started making assumptions about attending. When she asked what time the party started and whether she should bring a gift, I realised I needed to have a difficult conversation. I gently explained that this particular event was really just for immediate family, and that it was going to be quite small and intimate. I tried to frame it as being about my grandmother's preferences rather than about excluding Selena personally. Selene's reaction caught me off guard. She seemed genuinely hurt and confused about why she wasn't being included. She pointed out that she'd been to dozens of my family events over the past 2 years, that she knew my grandmother well, and that she'd already planned her weekend around attending the party. She made it sound like I was suddenly changing the rules of our friendship. She reminded me of all the times my family had welcomed her, all the contributions she'd made to various celebrations, and all the relationships she'd built with my relatives. She said it felt cruel to exclude her from this particular event when she'd become such a regular part of our family gatherings. I tried to explain that there's a difference between being welcomed as a friend and being automatically included in every family occasion. I said that while my family enjoyed her company, some events were specifically for blood relatives and lifelong family friends. But Celine argued that she'd earned her place at family events through years of participation and contribution. The conversation became more heated when Celine accused me of being embarrassed by her or not considering her a close enough friend to warrant family inclusion. She said that if our friendship was as important as I claimed, she should be treated like family at family events. She made it sound like excluding her was a rejection of our entire relationship. I ended up feeling guilty and confused about my own boundaries. Was I being unfair to suddenly exclude someone who'd been included in so many previous events? Had I inadvertently led her to believe she was always welcome at family gatherings? Or was it reasonable to expect that she would understand the difference between being invited and assuming inclusion? The birthday party happened without Selene, but I felt uncomfortable the entire time. I kept thinking about how hurt she'd seemed and wondering if I'd handled the situation poorly. My family asked where she was, and I had to explain that not every event was appropriate for non-family members, which led to some awkward conversations. Since then, Selene has been distant and cool toward me. She's stopped asking about family events, but she's also stopped being as warm and engaging in our regular friendship. I can tell she's still hurt about being excluded from the birthday party, and I'm not sure how to repair the relationship without either apologising for setting boundaries or committing to including her in future family gatherings. The whole situation has made me realise that I should have been clearer about boundaries from the beginning. By allowing her to attend so many family events, I inadvertently created an expectation that she would always be included. Now I'm in the difficult position of trying to re-establish limits without damaging a friendship that's important to me. That story is over. The slow escalation from one graduation party to expecting automatic inclusion in every family event is almost impressive in its audacity. Some people really will take an inch and then build a vacation home on the entire mile. Setting boundaries after years of enabling self-invitation is always going to be messy. Next up is a sibling story that'll make you want to put a passcode on everything you own. My brother took my phone and changed my contacts as a prank. This happened about 2 weeks ago, and I'm still dealing with the consequences of what Clint thought was hilarious, but turned out to be a complete nightmare for my personal and professional life. I was staying at my parents' house for the weekend, helping them clean out the garage. Clint was there too, supposedly helping, but mostly just going through old boxes and making jokes about our childhood stuff. At one point, I left my phone on the kitchen counter while I went outside to load some boxes into my car. When I came back in, Clint was sitting at the kitchen table with this mischievous grin on his face. He handed me my phone and said he'd done me a favour by organising my contacts better. I didn't think much of it at first because Clint's always been the type to mess around with people's stuff, but usually in harmless ways. It wasn't until Monday morning that I realised what he'd actually done. I was running late for work and needed to text my boss that I'd be about 15 minutes behind schedule. I scrolled through my contacts looking for his name, but instead of finding my boss listed as Robert Martinez, I found an entry called Daddy Issues. I stared at my phone for a moment, trying to figure out what had happened. I started scrolling through my entire contact list, and that's when I saw the full extent of Clint's prank. Every single contact in my phone had been renamed with what he apparently thought were clever or funny alternatives. My mum was now listed as Birth Giver. My best friend was renamed Drama Queen. My dentist had become Tooth Torturer. Some of the names were just silly, but others were genuinely inappropriate or embarrassing. My coworker, who I barely know, was renamed Hot Mess, and my ex-girlfriend was changed to Dodged Bullet. My landlord was now Rent Vampire, and my gym trainer was called Muscle Daddy. I didn't have time to change everything back before work, so I tried to remember which ridiculous name corresponded to my boss. I took my best guess and sent a text to Daddy Issues explaining that I was running late. Thankfully, it was actually my boss, but getting a response that said, "No problem, see you when you get here," from someone listed as Daddy Issues in my phone was surreal. Throughout the week, I kept running into problems because I couldn't find the contacts I needed. When my doctor's office called to reschedule an appointment, I couldn't call them back because I had no idea what Clint had renamed them. I spent 20 minutes scrolling through entries like Pill Pusher and Lab Coat Weirdo before I finally found them listed as Death Preventer. The worst incident happened when I was trying to text my girlfriend about dinner plans. I was looking for her name, which is normally just saved as Lauren, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I scrolled through the entire list twice before I realised she must be one of the renamed contacts. I started going through them systematically, trying to figure out which one might be her. I thought I'd found her when I saw an entry called Future Wife. which seemed like something Clint might use since he knows Lauren and I have been talking about moving in together. I sent her a text asking what she wanted to do for dinner, but the response I got back was not from Lauren. It was from my mum, asking why I was texting her about dinner plans when we'd already eaten together the night before. Apparently, Clint had thought it would be funny to name my mum future wife, which is disturbing on multiple levels. I had to explain to my mum that Clint had messed with my phone and that the text wasn't meant for her. She thought it was hilarious, but I was mortified. I finally found Lauren listed as better half, which was actually kind of sweet compared to some of the other names. But by then, I'd already sent confused texts to the wrong people multiple times and was completely frustrated with the whole situation. The real problem came when I was trying to contact a potential new client for my freelance work. I'd been corresponding with them via email, but they'd asked me to call them to discuss project details. I had their number saved in my phone, but I couldn't remember their name well enough to figure out which of Clint's ridiculous contact names they might be. I ended up calling someone listed as Moneybags, thinking it might be the client since they'd mentioned having a decent budget for the project. Instead, I reached my wealthy uncle, who was very confused about why I was calling him to discuss web design services. I had to apologize and explain the situation, which led to a 10-minute conversation about how kids these days don't respect other people's property. I finally found the client listed as potential payday, but by then I'd wasted so much time and felt so unprofessional that I was nervous during our call. Fortunately, they were understanding when I briefly explained that my brother had pranked my phone, but it definitely didn't make the best impression. It took me almost 3 hours to go through every contact and change them back to their proper names. Some of them I had to guess at because I couldn't remember exactly how I'd originally saved them. My plumber, who was renamed Pipe Dreams, took me forever to figure out because I rarely call him and couldn't remember his actual name. The worst part was discovering some of the more offensive names Clint had used. He'd renamed my elderly neighbour as Fossil and my co-worker with anxiety as Nervous Wreck. These weren't just silly pranks, they were genuinely mean-spirited, and I was horrified thinking about what might have happened if I'd accidentally shown my phone to the wrong person. When I called Clint to confront him about it, he was laughing so hard he could barely speak. He thought the whole thing was the funniest prank he'd ever pulled and kept asking me to tell him about the mix-ups I'd had. When I explained how it had affected my work and personal relationships, he said I was being too sensitive and that it was just harmless fun. He couldn't understand why I was so upset about something that took me a few hours to fix. He said that if I couldn't handle a simple prank, I needed to lighten up and learn to laugh at myself. But this wasn't about my sense of humour. It was about him messing with my personal property and potentially damaging my professional relationships. I've changed all my passwords and put a lock on my phone that Clint doesn't know. I also told my parents about what happened, and while they thought some of it was funny, they agreed that Clint had crossed a line by potentially interfering with my work contacts. That story is over. The complete lack of consideration for how this might affect someone's professional life is just mind-blowing. Some people really think causing chaos in other people's lives counts as harmless fun. I can't imagine the panic of trying to contact important people when every name in your phone has been turned into a joke. Speaking of people who don't understand professional boundaries, this next story involves a manager who thinks bathroom breaks are a privilege that needs to be earned. My manager micromanages bathroom breaks. I work at a small marketing company where my manager Leah has some very strange ideas about productivity and time management. Over the past few months, she's been implementing increasingly bizarre policies that make the workplace feel more like a prison than a professional environment. It started about 3 months ago when Leah announced that she'd been tracking employee productivity and noticed that people were taking too many breaks throughout the day. She said that frequent interruptions were hurting our team's output and that we needed to be more mindful of our time management. At first, this seemed like reasonable feedback about staying focused during work hours, but then she started getting specific about bathroom breaks. Leah announced that she'd been timing how long people were away from their desks, and that some employees were spending what she considered excessive time in the restroom. She said that bathroom breaks should be quick and efficient, and that anything longer than 5 minutes was probably unnecessary. I thought she was joking at first. The idea that a manager would actually time bathroom breaks seemed so absurd that I assumed she was making a point about general productivity rather than literally monitoring our bodily functions. But over the next few weeks, it became clear that Leah was completely serious about this policy. She started making comments when people returned from the bathroom. If someone was gone for what she deemed too long, she'd say things like, "Feeling better now?" or "That must have been quite an adventure." She'd make these remarks loudly enough for other people to hear, which made everyone uncomfortable and self-conscious. The situation escalated when Leah began keeping a log of bathroom breaks. She had a notebook where she'd write down who went to the bathroom and what time they left their desk. When people returned, she'd note their return time and calculate how long they'd been gone. She'd then make comments about whether the duration was reasonable or excessive. I couldn't believe this was actually happening in a professional workplace. The idea that a grown adult was monitoring and timing other adults' bathroom usage seemed like something out of a dystopian novel, not a legitimate management strategy. But Leah was treating it like a serious business initiative. Our next story comes from someone who learned that even the people closest to us can sometimes take credit where it's not due. My partner took credit for the gift I bought their mum. I've been with Amira for 3 years now, and overall our relationship has been pretty solid. We moved in together about a year ago, and things have been going well. Her family has always been welcoming to me, especially her mum, who treats me like one of her own kids. Amira's mum, Patricia, has this thing where she collects vintage jewellery, particularly brooches from the 1940s and 50s. She's shown me her collection multiple times when we visit, and she always lights up talking about where she found each piece, or the history behind certain designs. It's become something I genuinely enjoy discussing with her, because you can see how passionate she is about it. Patricia's birthday was coming up last month, and I really wanted to get her something special. I spent weeks researching and hunting through estate sales and antique shops, looking for the perfect piece. I finally found this absolutely stunning Art Deco brooch from 1947 with intricate silverwork and genuine pearls. It was exactly the kind of thing she'd love, and honestly, it wasn't cheap. I spent about $200 on it, which was a stretch for my budget, but I wanted to show Patricia how much I appreciated her treating me like family. I was so excited about the gift that I showed it to Amira a few days before the birthday dinner. She agreed it was perfect and said her mum would absolutely love it. We wrapped it together and put both our names on the card, which I thought was normal since we're a couple, and it was a family gift. The birthday dinner was at Patricia's favourite restaurant with about 15 family members present. When it came time for gifts, Patricia opened ours and her face just lit up. She held up the brooch and showed it to everyone at the table, talking about how beautiful it was and how it would fit perfectly in her collection. I was beaming, feeling so proud that I'd chosen something that made her so happy. That's when Amira stood up and started talking. She told everyone about how she'd been searching for months to find the perfect piece, how she'd visited dozens of antique shops and estate sales, how she'd learned so much about Art Deco jewellery in the process. She described the exact process I'd gone through, down to specific shops I'd visited that she'd never even been to. She talked about the craftsmanship of the piece, using terminology I'd taught her when I was explaining why I'd chosen this particular brooch. I sat there in complete shock as Amira told my entire story as if it were her own experience. She talked about how important it was to her to find something meaningful for her mum, how she wanted to show her appreciation for everything Patricia had done for her over the years. The whole family was praising Amira for being so thoughtful and putting so much effort into finding the perfect gift. Patricia hugged Amira and got teary-eyed talking about what a wonderful daughter she had, how touched she was that Amira had put so much time and research into finding something so special. I watched this entire scene unfold and couldn't believe what was happening. When Patricia thanked me, It was just a brief acknowledgement that I'd helped Amira pick it out. The way Amira had presented it made it sound like I'd maybe tagged along to a shop or two, but that this was entirely her project and her gift. After dinner, I pulled Amira aside and asked her why she'd taken complete credit for the gift. She seemed confused and said she hadn't taken credit, that we'd given it together. I reminded her that she'd literally told everyone about my entire process of finding the brooch, claiming she'd done all the research and shopping. Amira said she'd gotten caught up in the moment and wanted to make sure her mum knew how much thought had gone into the gift. She said it didn't matter who actually bought it. What mattered was that Patricia was happy. When I pointed out that I'd spent my own money on it, she said we were a couple and our money was shared anyway, even though we keep separate finances. The conversation got heated when I explained how hurt I was, that she'd taken credit for something I'd put so much effort and money into. Amira accused me of being petty and caring too much about getting recognition. She said I was making her mum's birthday about my ego, instead of just being happy that Patricia loved the gift. But it wasn't about ego. It was about the fact that I'd specifically chosen something meaningful based on conversations I'd had with Patricia about her collection. I'd invested time, money, and genuine thought into making her happy, and Amira had essentially erased my entire contribution to make herself look like the perfect daughter. The worst part is that now Patricia thinks Amira is this incredibly thoughtful person who goes above and beyond for family, while I'm just the boyfriend who tags along. It's changed the dynamic of how Patricia sees me, and I can't exactly correct the record without causing family drama. Amira still doesn't think she did anything wrong. She keeps saying that as a couple, we should be happy when either of us makes her family happy. But there's a difference between sharing credit and completely taking over someone else's story and effort. I've been wondering if I'm overreacting, but I keep thinking about how deliberately she told my story as her own. She didn't accidentally take credit. She actively chose to claim every detail of my experience as hers. That story is over. The level of calculated deception here is just stunning. She didn't just take credit, she literally stole his entire experience and retold it as her own personal journey, and then had the nerve to act like he was being petty for being upset about it. Some people really will rewrite history to make themselves look good, even when it means completely erasing someone else's thoughtfulness and effort. Speaking of people who take things that aren't theirs, this next story shows what happens when workplace sabotage masquerades as innocent mistakes. My coworker always accidentally deletes my files. I work at a mid-sized accounting firm downtown, and I've been there for about 2 years. The office is pretty typical, with individual cubicles and shared network drives where we store all our project files. Most of my co-workers are professional and easy to work with, except for one guy named Jonas, who sits about 3 cubicles away from me. Jonas has been with the company for about 5 years, so he definitely knows his way around our systems. He's always been friendly enough in person, makes small talk about weekend plans, compliments my work when our boss is around. On the surface, everything seems normal between us, but over the past 8 months, I've been having this really strange problem. My project files keep getting deleted from the shared drive. Not just any files, specifically the ones I'm working on for major clients or important deadlines. It's happened 12 times now, and I've started keeping a log because it was getting so ridiculous. The first time it happened, I figured it was just a technical glitch. I had a presentation due for a client meeting the next morning, and when I went to make final edits the night before, the entire file was gone. Not just moved to a different folder, completely deleted. I had to work until 3 in the morning recreating it from backup notes and earlier drafts. When I mentioned it to Jonas the next day, he seemed genuinely concerned and suggested I check with IT about system issues. He even offered to help me look through backup files, which I thought was really nice of him. The second time it happened, I was more suspicious. Another major project file gone right before a deadline. This time, I asked IT to check the system logs to see what had happened. They told me the file had been manually deleted by someone with access to that folder, but they couldn't tell me who without doing a more extensive investigation that would require manager approval. I decided not to escalate it since I couldn't prove anything, but I started being more careful about backing up my work. The third time, I was ready. I'd been working on a quarterly report that was due the following week, and I had copies saved in multiple locations. Sure enough, the main file disappeared 2 days before the deadline. This time, I immediately checked with IT and asked them to run the logs. They told me the file had been deleted at 6:47 p.m. the previous evening. I checked my keycard logs and confirmed I'd left the office at 5:30 that day. The next morning, Jonas casually asked how my quarterly report was coming along. He mentioned that he'd stayed late the night before to catch up on some work and had seen that I'd already left. When I told him about the file being deleted, he acted shocked and concerned, offering to help me recreate it if needed. That's when I started putting the pieces together. Jonas always seemed to know exactly which files had been deleted and was always quick to offer help. He'd ask about specific projects right around the times when files would disappear, and he always had an excuse for why he'd been in the office late or had accessed the shared drives. I started paying closer attention to the pattern. The deletions only happened to my files, never to any other team members' work. They only occurred when Jonas had been in the office late, or had some reason to be using the shared system, and they always happened right before major deadlines when losing the file would cause maximum stress and damage. The most telling incident happened last month. I was working on a presentation for our biggest client, something that could potentially lead to a promotion if it went well. I'd been putting extra effort into this project for weeks, staying late to perfect every detail. 3 days before the presentation, I mentioned to Jonas how excited I was about it and how much work I'd put in. That night, I got a text from him at 8:15 p.m. saying he'd forgotten something at the office and had to go back to grab it. At 8:47 p.m, my presentation file was deleted. When I confronted Jonas about it the next day, he acted completely baffled. He said he'd just grabbed his phone charger from his desk and left immediately. He suggested maybe I should be more careful about saving my work properly, implying that I might have accidentally deleted it myself. But I'd learned from previous incidents. This time, I'd been saving copies every few minutes and had a complete backup. I was able to present on schedule, and it went perfectly. I got the promotion I was hoping for. After that success, the deletions stopped for a while. But as soon as I started working on my first major project in my new role, they started again. This time, I was ready with documentation. I'd been keeping detailed logs of every deletion, including timestamps, what projects were affected, and Jonas's whereabouts during each incident. I also started saving files with slightly different names in hidden folders that Jonas wouldn't know to look for. Last week, I finally had enough evidence to take to my manager. I showed her the pattern of deletions, the fact that they only affected my work, and the correlation with Jonas's after-hours access to the system. I also demonstrated that I had proper backups of everything, proving that I wasn't just being careless with my files. My manager took it seriously and initiated an investigation with IT. They pulled complete access logs for the past year and found that Jonas had accessed and deleted my files on 17 different occasions. Each deletion corresponded to a time when he'd stayed late or come in on weekends, supposedly to work on his own projects. When confronted with the evidence, Jonas initially denied everything. He claimed it must be some kind of system error or that someone else was using his login credentials. But when IT showed him the specific timestamps and file paths, he finally admitted to what he'd been doing. His explanation was that he felt I was getting too much attention from management and landing the best projects. He said he'd been trying to level the playing field by creating setbacks that would make me look less reliable. He actually seemed to think this was a reasonable approach to workplace competition. Jonas was fired immediately. My manager apologized for not taking my concerns seriously earlier and assured me that they'd be implementing better security measures to prevent this kind of sabotage in the future. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if I can't prove it right away. Jonas had been systematically undermining my work for months while pretending to be helpful and concerned. If I hadn't started documenting everything, he probably would have continued until he damaged my reputation enough to affect my career. That story's over. 17 separate acts of sabotage disguised as helpful concern is genuinely sociopathic behaviour. The fact that he thought creating setbacks for a coworker was just levelling the playing field shows how twisted his mindset was. Thank goodness for IT logs and a manager who finally took it seriously. Now let's talk about friends who think social media posts are more important than honesty. My friend lied about being sick, and I saw them at the mall. I've been friends with Clint for about 4 years now. We met in college and stayed close even after graduation. He's usually a pretty reliable friend, the kind of person you can count on to show up when he says he will. We hang out maybe twice a week, grab dinner, see movies, just normal friend stuff. Last Friday, Clint and I had plans to check out this new arcade bar that opened downtown. We'd been talking about going for weeks, and I was really looking forward to it because I'd had a stressful week at work and needed to blow off some steam. We'd made the plans on Monday and confirmed them on Thursday, so everything seemed set. Friday afternoon, around 3 p.m, I got a text from Clint saying he was feeling really sick and didn't think he could make it out that evening. He said he'd woken up with a bad headache and nausea, and it had gotten worse throughout the day. He apologised for the short notice and said he'd make it up to me once he was feeling better. I was disappointed but not upset. People get sick, and I'd rather he stay home and rest than push himself to go out when he's not feeling well. I told him to feel better and that we could reschedule for the following week. Since my evening was suddenly free, I decided to do some shopping I'd been putting off. I needed new running shoes and wanted to browse around for a birthday gift for my sister. The mall seemed like the perfect place to kill a few hours and maybe grab dinner at the food court. I was walking through the main corridor around 6 p.m. when I spotted someone who looked familiar near the GameStop. It was Clint, very much not sick, laughing and talking with 2 people I didn't recognise. He was carrying shopping bags and looked completely fine, not like someone who'd been battling a headache and nausea all day. At first, I thought maybe I was mistaken. It could have been someone who just looked like Clint from a distance, but as I got closer there was no doubt it was him. Same distinctive jacket he always wears, same laugh I'd heard 1,000 times, definitely Clint. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to walk over and say hi, but I was also confused about why he'd lied about being sick. Maybe he'd suddenly felt better and decided to run quick errands. That seemed possible, even if it was weird that he hadn't texted me to let me know. I decided to just observe for a few minutes to see what was going on. Clint and his companions went into a clothing store, spent about 20 minutes looking at clothes, then headed to the food court. They got food and sat down to eat, looking like they were having a great time. This definitely wasn't the behaviour of someone who'd been sick all day and was just running necessary errands. This was someone enjoying a social evening out with friends. I was about to leave and pretend I'd never seen him when Clint pulled out his phone and took a selfie with his companions. They were all smiling and making funny faces, clearly documenting their mall hangout. Within minutes, I saw the photo pop up on his Instagram story with the caption, "Impromptu mall adventure with new friends." That's when I got really confused and honestly a little hurt. Not only had he lied about being sick to cancel our plans, but he was actively posting about the alternative plans he'd made instead. It felt like he'd specifically chosen to hang out with other people over me, then lied about it to avoid hurting my feelings or having an awkward conversation. I left the mall without approaching him and spent the weekend trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I kept going back and forth between being understanding and being annoyed. Maybe something had come up with these friends that he couldn't reschedule, and he'd panicked and made up the sick excuse instead of being honest. Monday morning, I got a text from Clint asking how my weekend was and mentioning that he was feeling much better. He said he'd spent most of Friday night sleeping and was glad the bug had passed quickly. I decided to be direct and asked if he'd done anything over the weekend once he started feeling better. He said he'd mostly just rested and caught up on some TV shows, maybe ran a few quick errands on Saturday. That's when I realised he was doubling down on the lie instead of coming clean. I sent him a screenshot of his Instagram story from Friday night and asked if he wanted to explain what had actually happened. Clint called me immediately, sounding panicked. He admitted that he hadn't been sick and apologised for lying. His explanation was that these two friends from his hometown had surprised him by driving down for the weekend, and he'd felt obligated to hang out with them since they'd made the trip specifically to see him. He said he'd panicked when they showed up because he already had plans with me, and instead of asking if we could all hang out together or if we could reschedule, he'd just made up the sick excuse because it seemed easier in the moment. I asked why he hadn't just been honest about the situation. I would have understood if he'd said his hometown friends were visiting unexpectedly and asked to reschedule. That's completely reasonable and wouldn't have hurt my feelings at all. Clint said he'd been worried I'd be upset about the last-minute change and had thought the sick excuse would be easier to deal with. He also admitted that his hometown friends had specifically wanted it to be just the three of them catching up, and he hadn't known how to explain that without sounding like he was choosing them over me. I appreciated his honesty, but I was still bothered by the lying. It wasn't just the cancelled plans that upset me, it was the fact that he'd created an elaborate story and then posted evidence of his actual activities on social media. It showed a level of thoughtlessness that made me question how much he actually considered my feelings. We talked it out, and Clint apologised again. He acknowledged that he should have just been straightforward about the situation from the beginning. He said he'd learned his lesson about lying to avoid uncomfortable conversations, but the whole thing left me feeling uncertain about our friendship. If he was willing to lie about something this minor, what else might he not be honest about? And the fact that he'd posted about his actual plans while maintaining the lie to me showed a kind of carelessness that bothered me more than the original cancellation would have. That story is over. The Instagram post while maintaining the sick lie is what really gets me. He literally documented his deception for everyone to see. Sometimes being honest about last-minute changes is so much simpler than creating elaborate lies that fall apart the moment someone opens social media. Our next story proves that some people will use any occasion to make themselves the centre of attention. My sister used my graduation as an excuse to announce her new business. I graduated from college last month with my bachelor's degree in engineering. It was a huge milestone for me because I was the first person in my family to graduate from a 4-year university. I'd worked part-time jobs throughout school to help pay for tuition and had really pushed myself academically to graduate with honours. My family was incredibly proud and wanted to celebrate with a big dinner at my favourite restaurant. We reserved the back room for about 20 people, including my parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles and cousins. Everyone was dressed up and excited to celebrate this achievement that had taken me 4 years of hard work to reach. My sister Leah, who's 3 years older than me, had been going through some career changes lately. She'd quit her job at a marketing firm a few months earlier and had been talking about starting her own social media consulting business. She'd mentioned it in passing during family conversations, but it was still pretty early stages, more of an idea than an actual business. The dinner started off perfectly. My dad gave a really touching toast about how proud he was of my dedication and perseverance. My grandmother talked about how she'd always known I was going to do something special. People were sharing memories of helping me with homework when I was younger or celebrating when I got accepted to college. It was exactly the kind of recognition and celebration I'd been hoping for. We were about halfway through dinner when Leah stood up and asked for everyone's attention. I figured she was going to give her own toast or share a memory about our childhood. Instead, she started talking about how proud she was of me, but how my graduation had inspired her to take a big leap in her own life. She announced that she was officially launching her social media consulting business and had decided that today was the perfect day to make it official. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of business cards and flyers. She started walking around the table, handing them out to everyone and explaining her services. Leah talked for about 10 minutes about her business plan, her target clients, and her pricing structure. She asked family members to share her information with their friends and co-workers. She even mentioned that she was offering a family discount if anyone wanted to hire her for their small business or personal brand. I sat there watching my graduation dinner turn into a business networking event. Family members who'd been focused on congratulating me were now asking Leah questions about her services and discussing their own social media needs. The conversation completely shifted from my achievement to her entrepreneurial venture. My cousin asked if Leah could help with his restaurant's Instagram account. My aunt wanted to know if Leah could teach her how to promote her craft business on Facebook. My uncle started talking about how his construction company needed help with their online presence. By the time Leah finished her impromptu business presentation and everyone had discussed their potential consulting needs, dessert was being served. The moment to celebrate my graduation had passed, and the energy in the room was now focused on Leah's business launch. When people started to leave, most of the congratulations I received were brief afterthoughts. Congratulations on graduating, and make sure you give Leah's information to any of your friends who might need social media help. My achievement had become secondary to promoting my sister's new venture. After everyone left, I asked Leah why she'd chosen my graduation dinner to announce her business. She said she'd gotten excited seeing the whole family together and thought it was the perfect opportunity to share her news with everyone at once. She said she hoped I didn't mind and that she was just trying to be efficient by combining celebrations. I explained that I did mind, that this was supposed to be my day to celebrate something I'd worked really hard for, and that her business announcement had completely overshadowed that. Leah seemed surprised that I was upset and said she'd thought I'd be happy that she was finally pursuing her entrepreneurial dreams. She said that as siblings, we should support each other's successes and that my graduation had motivated her to take this big step. She made it sound like her business announcement was somehow a tribute to my achievement, rather than what it actually was, which was hijacking my celebration for her own purposes. The worst part is that now, when family members talk about that dinner, they remember it as the day Leah launched her business. My graduation has become a footnote in the story of her entrepreneurial journey. She's even posted about it on her new business social media, describing how my success inspired her to take the leap into consulting. I'm proud of Leah for starting her own business, and I want to support her success, but I'm also hurt that she chose to make my graduation about her career change. There were so many other opportunities for her to announce her business launch, but she chose the one day that was specifically meant to celebrate my accomplishment. That story is over. Using someone else's milestone as a launching pad for your own announcement is incredibly selfish. She literally turned his graduation dinner into her business networking event, and then acted like it was somehow a tribute to his success. Some people really can't stand not being the center of attention for even one evening. Speaking of people who make everything about themselves, this next story shows what happens when someone decides your gift isn't worthy of their image. My partner hid my birthday gift because they didn't like what I got them. I've been dating Ethan for about 2 years now, and we've always been pretty thoughtful about gifts for each other. Not expensive stuff necessarily, but things that show we pay attention to each other's interests and personalities. His birthday was coming up last month, and I'd been planning something special for weeks. Ethan is really into vintage records and has been slowly building a collection over the past few years. He's always browsing record stores and online marketplaces, looking for specific albums or rare pressings. I've gone with him on these hunting trips plenty of times, and learned a lot about what he looks for in terms of condition, pressing quality, and which albums are particularly meaningful to him. About a month before his birthday, Ethan mentioned that he'd been searching for an original pressing of this jazz album from the 1960s. It was by a musician he'd introduced me to early in our relationship, someone whose music had become part of our shared soundtrack. He'd been looking for this specific album for over a year, but hadn't been able to find it in good condition at a reasonable price. I decided this would be the perfect birthday gift. I spent weeks searching online, calling record stores in different cities and even reaching out to collectors through forums. Finally, I found a copy in excellent condition from a dealer in Chicago. It wasn't cheap, probably the most I'd ever spent on a gift for anyone, but I knew how much it would mean to Ethan. The dealer confirmed that the pressing was authentic and from the original run. The condition was described as near mint, with just minor signs of age on the cover. I was so excited about this gift because I knew it was exactly what Ethan had been hoping to find, and I put genuine effort into tracking it down. His birthday celebration was at his apartment with about 8 of his friends. I'd wrapped the record carefully and was really looking forward to seeing his reaction when he opened it. When gift time came, I handed him my present and watched as he unwrapped it. Ethan's face lit up when he saw what it was. He immediately recognized the album and seemed genuinely excited. He thanked me and said he couldn't believe I'd found it. For a moment, I felt like I'd nailed the perfect gift. But then Ethan looked more closely at the album cover and his expression changed. He pointed out some minor wear on the corners and mentioned that the colour seemed slightly faded. He said it was still a great find, but not quite the condition he'd been hoping for. He thanked me again, but his enthusiasm had definitely diminished. I felt a little disappointed that the condition wasn't perfect, but I figured he'd still appreciate having the album, even if it wasn't mint condition. Finding any copy of this particular pressing was supposed to be the hard part. The weird part happened later in the evening. When other friends were showing off gifts they'd received or brought, Ethan didn't mention the record at all. When someone asked what I'd gotten him, he just said something really thoughtful, but didn't elaborate or show it to anyone. I found the record later that evening, tucked away in his bedroom closet, instead of displayed with his other albums or even just sitting out where people could see it. When I asked why he'd put it away, Ethan said he wanted to keep it safe from the party environment. Over the next few days, I noticed the album never appeared in his collection display. When I asked about it, Ethan said he was still deciding where to put it. A week later, I found it still in the closet, still in the wrapping I'd used, like he hadn't even taken it out to look at it properly. When I directly asked why he wasn't displaying the album with his other records, Ethan finally admitted the truth. He said that while he appreciated the effort I'd put into finding it, the condition wasn't good enough to show to other collectors or friends who knew about records. He said he was embarrassed to display it because people would notice the wear and fading, and it would reflect poorly on his collection standards. I was completely taken aback. This was supposed to be a thoughtful gift that showed I'd been paying attention to his interests. Instead, Ethan was treating it like something shameful that needed to be hidden because it didn't meet his aesthetic standards. I pointed out that this was the exact album he'd been searching for, and that finding it in any condition should have been exciting. Ethan said he was grateful, but that he'd rather wait and keep looking for a better copy than settle for one with visible flaws. The conversation got uncomfortable when I realised that Ethan cared more about how his record collection looked to other people than he did about the thought and effort I'd put into finding this gift. He was literally hiding my birthday present because he was embarrassed by its condition. I asked him what I was supposed to think about the fact that my gift was too flawed for him to display. Ethan said I was being too sensitive, and that this wasn't about the gift itself, but about his standards as a collector. He said I should understand that he takes his collection seriously and can't just add albums that don't meet his criteria. But it wasn't really about collecting standards. It was about the fact that he'd rather hurt my feelings than display a gift that wasn't perfect enough for his image. He'd chosen to hide my thoughtfulness rather than explain to friends that his girlfriend had found him something he'd been searching for, even if it wasn't in perfect condition. The album is still in his closet, Ethan keeps saying he'll decide what to do with it eventually, but it's been over a month now. He's bought other records since then that are proudly displayed in his collection, while my gift remains hidden like a shameful secret. I've started questioning whether Ethan values our relationship more than his image, or if he's always this concerned about what other people think of his possessions. The gift was supposed to show that I'd been listening to his interests and cared enough to hunt down something special for him. Instead, I learned that my effort doesn't matter if the result doesn't meet his standards for public display. That story is over. Hiding someone's thoughtful gift because it's not perfect enough for your image is genuinely heartless. She spent weeks tracking down exactly what he wanted, and he's treating it like it's too embarrassing to acknowledge. Some people care more about appearing sophisticated than appreciating genuine effort from the people who love them. Now let's talk about bosses who think illness is just an inconvenience to their schedule. My boss told me to work while I had a fever. I work at a small marketing agency with about 12 employees. It's one of those places that tries to be like a family, but really just uses that as an excuse to blur professional boundaries and expect people to go above and beyond without proper compensation. My boss, Celine, is the owner and has very strong opinions about work ethic and dedication. I've been with the company for about 8 months, and I generally like the work itself. The projects are interesting, and I get along well with most of my co-workers. But Celine has this attitude about sick days that's always bothered me. She acts like taking time off for illness is a personal failing, rather than a normal part of human existence. Last Tuesday I woke up feeling absolutely terrible. I had a fever of 101.5, body aches, chills, and a splitting headache. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck and could barely get out of bed to check my temperature. This wasn't just feeling a little under the weather. This was legitimate illness that needed rest and recovery. I called the office around 7:30 a.m. to let Selena know I wouldn't be coming in. I explained that I had a fever and didn't want to risk getting other people sick. I figured this would be a straightforward conversation, just a quick call to report my absence and confirm that I'd be back when I was feeling better. Selena's response was not what I expected. She asked how high my fever was, and when I told her 101.5, she said that wasn't really that serious, and that I could probably work from home if I wasn't feeling up to coming into the office. She said we had a client presentation that afternoon that I'd been working on, and it would be really inconvenient if I wasn't available to make final edits. I explained that I felt too sick to work effectively, and that I thought it would be better to rest and recover so I could come back stronger the next day. Celine sighed and said that she'd hoped I was more committed to the team than this. She said that in her experience, people who really cared about their jobs found ways to contribute even when they weren't feeling perfect. The conversation got more uncomfortable when Celine started talking about how she'd worked through much worse illnesses and how that's what separated dedicated employees from people who just saw their job as a paycheck. She said she'd once given a presentation while she had food poisoning because the client was counting on her. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to be difficult, but that I genuinely felt too sick to produce quality work. Selena said that if I wasn't willing to work from home, the least I could do was send her all my files so someone else could handle the presentation updates. She made it sound like I was abandoning the team in their time of need. By the end of the call, I felt guilty for being sick. Celine had managed to make my fever feel like a personal choice I was making to inconvenience everyone else. She said she'd handle things this time, but that she expected me to be more considerate of the team's needs in the future. I spent the day feeling worse both physically and emotionally. The fever climbed to 102 degrees by afternoon, and I was getting chills so bad I couldn't stop shaking. But I also felt this pressure to prove that I wasn't just being lazy or dramatic about being sick. Against my better judgment, I opened my laptop and tried to work on some smaller projects that didn't require intense focus. I managed to edit a few social media posts and respond to some emails, but everything took twice as long as usual because my brain felt like it was wrapped in cotton. I sent Selene updates on what I'd managed to accomplish, hoping to show that I was still contributing despite being sick. She responded with short acknowledgements, but also added more tasks, asking if I could review a contract and provide feedback on a new client proposal. By evening, I felt even worse and realised that trying to work while sick had probably prolonged my recovery. I should have been resting and letting my body fight off whatever illness I had, instead of forcing myself to stare at screens and think through complex problems. The next day, my fever had broken, but I still felt weak and tired. I came into the office because I was worried about Selene's reaction if I took another day off. She made a point of commenting on how much better I looked and said she was glad I was feeling more like myself. But then she made a comment that really bothered me. She said she appreciated that I'd found a way to contribute even while I was under the weather, and that it showed the kind of work ethic she valued in her employees. She said some people would have just stayed in bed and left the team hanging, but I'd shown real dedication. I realised that Selena had turned my illness into a test of my commitment to the job. By working while I had a fever, I'd apparently passed some kind of loyalty examination, but I'd also set a precedent that I was willing to sacrifice my health for her convenience. 2 weeks later, another coworker called in sick with what sounded like the same illness I'd had. I heard Selene on the phone with them, making similar comments about dedication and finding ways to contribute from home. She'd learned that she could guilt people into working through illness by questioning their commitment to the team. I started looking for a new job that same week. Working for someone who thinks a 102-degree fever is just an excuse to avoid work isn't sustainable long term. Some boundaries are too important to compromise, and my health is definitely one of them. That story's over. Making someone feel guilty for having a legitimate fever and then praising them for working through it is genuinely toxic management. She literally turned illness into a loyalty test and then used it as a template for manipulating other employees. Some bosses really think your body is just another company resource they can exploit. This next story shows how some friends think embarrassing you is just harmless fun. My friend took a joke too far and humiliated me in public. I've been friends with Ivy since high school, and she's always been the type of person who likes to be the centre of attention. Usually, it's harmless stuff, telling funny stories or making everyone laugh at parties, but sometimes she doesn't know when to stop, and last weekend she crossed a line that I'm still processing. We were meeting up for coffee at this new place downtown that's always packed on Saturday afternoons. I'd gotten there first and found a table, then texted Ivy to let her know where I was sitting. The cafe was completely full, probably 60 or 70 people spread across 2 floors, with that kind of buzzing conversation noise that happens when everyone's trying to talk over each other. When I was in elementary school, I had this really unfortunate nickname that kids used to tease me with. It was based on an embarrassing incident that happened during a school play when I was 8 years old. I won't go into details, but it involved a costume malfunction and became the source of endless playground mockery for the rest of elementary school. By the time I got to middle school, most people had forgotten about it, and I thought I'd left it behind forever. The only person who still remembered that nickname was Ivy, because we'd known each other since we were kids. She'd bring it up occasionally as a private joke between us, usually when we were reminiscing about childhood memories. I'd always made it clear that I didn't love when she used it, but in private conversations, it felt harmless enough. So I'm sitting at this crowded cafe, scrolling through my phone and waiting for Ivy to arrive. I see her walk through the front door and look around trying to spot me. The place is so packed and noisy that I figure she'll never find me just by looking. So I raise my hand and wave to get her attention. That's when Ivy decided to shout across the entire cafe. Not just call my actual name, but belt out my childhood nickname at the top of her lungs. She literally yelled it 3 times, getting louder each time because she thought I couldn't hear her over the noise. The entire cafe went quiet, like dead silent. 60+ people all turned to stare at me, while Ivy stood by the entrance grinning and waving like she'd just done something cute and funny. I felt my face burning with embarrassment as dozens of strangers looked at me, clearly wondering what kind of person has a nickname that sounds so ridiculous when shouted in public. Ivy walked over to my table, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just humiliated me in front of a room full of people. She sat down and started chatting about her morning like nothing had happened, while I was still trying to recover from the mortification of having my childhood trauma announced to an entire coffee shop. I tried to explain to her why what she'd done bothered me, but Ivy just laughed it off. She said it was funny and that I was being too sensitive about an old nickname. She said everyone in the cafe had probably already forgotten about it, which wasn't the point at all. The point was that she'd taken something I'd specifically told her I didn't like and amplified it in the most public way possible. She'd turned my discomfort into entertainment for herself, and when I tried to express how that felt, she dismissed my feelings as overreaction. We ended up having an argument right there in the cafe, which only made the situation more awkward, since people were still occasionally glancing over at us. Ivy kept saying I was ruining the mood, and that she'd just been trying to get my attention in a crowded space. She acted like using my most embarrassing childhood nickname was the most natural thing in the world. I left before we even ordered our coffee. I couldn't sit there and pretend everything was normal after she'd made me the centre of attention in such a mortifying way. Ivy texted me later, saying she didn't understand why I was so upset, and that she thought we were close enough friends that I wouldn't mind her being playful in public. But there's a difference between being playful and being thoughtless. She knew that nickname bothered me, and she chose to broadcast it to a room full of strangers anyway. It felt like she'd prioritised getting attention for herself over respecting my boundaries and dignity. That story is over. The second-hand embarrassment from this one is intense. There's nothing playful about shouting someone's childhood trauma across a crowded room and then acting confused when they are upset. Some people really think friendship means you don't get to have boundaries anymore. This brings us to someone who thought closure was worth going behind their partner's back. My partner reached out to my ex behind my back. I've been with Renee for about 1.5 years now, and our relationship has been really solid. We moved in together 6 months ago, and everything has felt natural and comfortable between us. Renee has always been understanding about my past relationships, and the fact that my breakup with my ex was pretty messy. My ex-girlfriend Carmen and I dated for 3 years and broke up about 8 months before I met Renee. The breakup was one of those situations where we both knew it wasn't working, but neither of us wanted to be the one to end it. When we finally did break up, there were a lot of unresolved feelings and things left unsaid. Carmen moved to a different city shortly after, and we haven't been in contact since. I've been open with Renee about the fact that the Carmen situation ended without much closure. I've mentioned that sometimes I wonder how she's doing, or whether we'll ever have a conversation that properly closes that chapter. But I've also been clear that I'm committed to moving forward and building something new with Renee. Last month, Renee started acting a little strange. She'd get distracted during conversations and seemed to be thinking about something else. When I'd ask what was on her mind, she'd say it was just work stress or family stuff. I figured she was going through something and would talk to me about it when she was ready. Then I noticed she was being more secretive with her phone. She'd take it with her to the bathroom or step outside to answer calls. When I asked who was calling, she'd give vague answers about coworkers or friends. It wasn't like her to be evasive about normal phone conversations. 2 weeks ago, I was using Renee's laptop to check my email because my phone was dead. When I opened the browser, her email was still logged in, and I could see the preview of her most recent messages. One of them was from an email address I didn't recognize, but the subject line said, "Following up on our conversation." I wasn't trying to snoop, but something about that subject line felt weird. I opened the email and saw that it was from Carmen. She was thanking Renee for reaching out and saying she was glad they'd had a chance to talk about everything that had happened between Carmen and me. I scrolled through the email thread and found that Renee had been corresponding with Carmen for almost 3 weeks. The initial message was Renee introducing herself as my current girlfriend and saying she wanted to understand more about our relationship and breakup. She told Carmen that I seemed to have unresolved feelings and that she thought it might help everyone if they could talk. Carmen had responded by sharing details about our relationship that felt very personal and private. She talked about fights we'd had, reasons she thought we'd grown apart, and her own feelings about how things had ended. She even mentioned specific conversations and intimate moments that I'd never shared with Renee. The most recent emails showed that Renee and Carmen had progressed to having actual phone conversations. Carmen had given Renee her number, and they'd talked twice in the past week. In their email exchanges, they were making plans to meet in person when Carmen came back to town for a work conference next month. I was completely stunned. My girlfriend had been secretly communicating with my ex for weeks, discussing intimate details of my past relationship, and planning to meet up without ever mentioning any of this to me. It felt like a massive violation of privacy and trust. When Renee came home that evening, I confronted her about what I'd found. She immediately got defensive and said she'd been trying to help me get closure with Carmen. She said she could tell I was still bothered by how things had ended, and she thought talking to Carmen might give her insight into how to support me better. I asked why she hadn't talked to me about this plan before reaching out to Carmen. Renee said she'd wanted to see what she could learn first, and then she was planning to tell me about it once she had more information. She made it sound like she was doing detective work on my behalf, but the emails I'd read showed that Renee wasn't just gathering information. She was having personal conversations with Carmen about their own feelings and experiences. She'd shared details about our current relationship and asked Carmen for advice about how to handle certain situations with me. I explained that going behind my back to contact my ex felt like a betrayal, regardless of her intentions. Renee said she was just trying to help and that she thought I'd be grateful once I understood what she was trying to do. She said Carmen had been really helpful in explaining things that had confused her about my behaviour. The worst part was that Renee seemed to think this was romantic or thoughtful. She kept talking about how much effort she'd put into understanding me better and how she was willing to have uncomfortable conversations to improve our relationship. She couldn't understand why I was upset instead of appreciative. I told her that my past relationship was private, and that if I wanted to reconnect with Carmen or get closure, that was my decision to make. Renee had inserted herself into a situation that had nothing to do with her, and had shared information about our current relationship with someone who didn't need to know those details. Renee finally agreed to stop communicating with Carmen, but she still doesn't think she did anything wrong. She keeps saying her heart was in the right place, and that she was just trying to be a supportive partner. She can't seem to grasp that good intentions don't justify going behind someone's back to dig into their past relationships. That story is over. Secretly interviewing your partner's ex about their relationship while pretending it's for their benefit is manipulation disguised as support. The fact that she planned to meet Carmen in person without ever mentioning any of this makes it even worse. Sometimes people use helping as an excuse to satisfy their own curiosity and control. Now let's hear about a cousin who thought a baby shower was the perfect venue for her personal drama. My cousin tried to make my baby shower about her divorce. I'm 7 months pregnant with my first child, and my family threw me a beautiful baby shower last weekend. We'd been planning it for months, and everyone was so excited to celebrate the upcoming arrival of my daughter. My mum, sister, and aunts had put together this lovely event at my grandmother's house, with decorations, games, and all the traditional baby shower activities. My cousin Mira was one of the first people I invited because we've always been close. She's 3 years older than me, and growing up she was like the big sister I never had. She's been going through a difficult divorce over the past year, which has been really hard on her emotionally and financially. I've tried to be supportive throughout the process, listening when she needed to vent and offering help when I could. The shower started off perfectly. About 20 women from both sides of my family were there, plus some close friends and co-workers. We played the typical games, everyone was laughing and having fun, and I was feeling so grateful for all the love and support surrounding this huge milestone in my life. When it came time to open gifts, everyone gathered around while I went through each present. People were taking pictures, making jokes about tiny baby clothes, and sharing advice about their own experiences with motherhood. It was exactly the kind of warm, celebratory atmosphere I'd been hoping for. About halfway through the gift opening, Mira asked if she could say something to the group. I figured she wanted to give a toast or share a memory, so I said of course. She stood up in front of everyone and started talking about how meaningful it was to be there celebrating new life during such a difficult time in her own life. Then she launched into a detailed account of her divorce proceedings. She talked about how her husband had been emotionally abusive, how she'd discovered he'd been hiding money, how her lawyer was incompetent, and how the whole process was destroying her financially. She went on for probably 15 minutes, getting more emotional as she talked. By the time she started crying, everyone in the room was focused on comforting Mira instead of celebrating my pregnancy. My grandmother got up to get her tissues. My aunt started rubbing her shoulders and asking if there was anything they could do to help. The conversation completely shifted from baby preparations to divorce support. I sat there holding a half-opened baby gift, watching my shower turn into a therapy session for Mira's marital problems. I felt terrible for her because I knew she was genuinely struggling, but I also couldn't believe she'd chosen this moment to unload all her emotional baggage onto my celebration. When Mira finished talking, several people started sharing their own divorce stories or offering advice about lawyers and financial planning. My shower had become a support group meeting, with my pregnancy as background noise to everyone else's relationship drama. I tried to redirect attention back to the gifts, but the mood had completely changed. People were still focused on Mira and her situation. When they did pay attention to the baby stuff, it felt forced and awkward, like they were just going through the motions while their minds were on more serious adult problems. The worst part was that Mira seemed to expect everyone to prioritize her emotional needs over my celebration. When I finally finished opening gifts, she made another comment about how difficult it was for her to see everyone so happy when her own life was falling apart. She said being around celebration made her divorce feel even more painful. After everyone left, I talked to my mum about what had happened. She agreed that Mira's timing had been inappropriate, but she also felt sorry for her and thought we should be understanding about how much she was struggling. She suggested that maybe Mira just needed to feel connected to family during a difficult time. I called Mira the next day to check on her, but also to address what had happened at the shower. I told her I was concerned about her and wanted to support her through the divorce, but that I'd felt hurt when my baby shower became focused on her problems instead of celebrating my pregnancy. Mira got defensive and said she hadn't meant to take attention away from me. She said she'd just been feeling overwhelmed being around so much happiness when her own life was in chaos. She made it sound like my pregnancy celebration had been emotionally triggering for her, and that talking about her divorce had been a coping mechanism. But there's a difference between feeling overwhelmed and choosing to make someone else's event about your own problems. Mira could have stepped outside if she needed a moment, or talked to someone privately if she was struggling. Instead, she'd used my baby shower as a platform to process her divorce in front of 20 people. The whole experience left me feeling like my pregnancy wasn't important enough to deserve one afternoon of undivided attention. Mira had essentially decided that her divorce was more worthy of everyone's focus than my upcoming motherhood, and then acted like I was being unsupportive when I tried to address it. That story is over. Turning someone's baby shower into your personal divorce therapy session is peak narcissistic behavior. She literally stood up and gave a 15-minute speech about her problems at an event specifically meant to celebrate someone else's major life milestone. Some people can't handle not being the center of attention, even at other people's celebrations. This brings us to a coworker who thinks office equipment maintains itself. My coworker refuses to refill the printer, but always uses it. I work in a small office with about 8 people, and we share one main printer that everyone uses for daily tasks. It's located in a central area between several cubicles, and it gets pretty heavy use throughout the day. The office manager established a simple system where whoever empties the paper tray is responsible for refilling it, which seems fair and reasonable. My co-worker Theo sits closest to the printer and probably uses it more than anyone else. He's constantly printing reports, presentations, and client documents. I'd estimate he uses the printer for at least 30% of its daily output, maybe more. Despite this heavy usage, Theo has never once refilled the paper tray in the 8 months I've been working here. The first few times I noticed the printer was empty after Theo had used it, I figured it was just coincidence. Maybe he'd used the last sheet without realizing it, or maybe someone else had emptied it right after him. I'd refill it without thinking much about it, because I needed to print something anyway. But then I started paying attention to the pattern. Theo would print large documents that would use up most or all of the remaining paper. When the printer inevitably ran out of paper in the middle of his job, he'd just leave his remaining pages in the print queue and walk away. The next person who tried to print anything would find an empty tray and have to refill it before they could complete their task. This happened so consistently that I realized Theo was doing it deliberately. He'd rather leave the printer empty and inconvenience the next person than spend 2 minutes refilling the paper tray himself. He was essentially making everyone else subsidize his heavy printer usage by handling the maintenance he should have been doing. The most frustrating part is how he handles it when someone points out that the printer is empty. If you mention that there's no paper, Theo will say something like, "Oh, I didn't realize," or "It must have run out after I finished printing." But his print jobs are often 20 or 30 pages long, so there's no way he doesn't notice when the printer stops working halfway through. Last week, I decided to test this theory. I watched Theo start a large print job, saw the paper run out after about 10 pages, and waited to see what he would do. He looked at the error message on the printer display, cancelled his remaining print job, and went back to his desk without refilling the paper. 20 minutes later, when I went to print a single document, I had to load paper before I could get anything done. When I asked Theo why he'd left the printer empty, he said he'd been in a hurry and figured someone else would handle it. He acted like refilling the printer was just a random chore that could be done by whoever happened to need it next, rather than the responsibility of the person who emptied it. I started keeping track of how often this happened. Over the course of 2 weeks, Theo left the printer empty 11 times. Each time, someone else had to refill it before they could print their own documents. He was essentially creating extra work for everyone else while avoiding any responsibility for maintaining equipment that he used more than anyone. The situation reached a breaking point when Theo left the printer empty right before an important client meeting. One of my co-workers needed to print presentation materials and discovered there was no paper. She had to scramble to refill the printer and reprint everything while the client was waiting in the conference room. When she mentioned this to Theo later, he said that running out of paper was just one of those things that happens in an office, and that everyone should be prepared to deal with minor inconveniences. He made it sound like printer maintenance was a shared responsibility that shouldn't fall on any particular person. But that's not how shared resources work. If you use something heavily, you have a greater responsibility to maintain it. Theo was benefiting from the printer more than anyone else while contributing nothing to its upkeep. He'd essentially decided that his time was more valuable than everyone else's and that other people should handle the mundane tasks associated with equipment he relied on daily. I finally brought the issue to our office manager, who confirmed that the policy was clear. Whoever empties the printer should refill it. She agreed to send a reminder email to the whole office about printer etiquette, which specifically mentioned that heavy users had a special responsibility to monitor paper levels. Theo's response to the email was to make jokes about printer police and act like the whole issue was much ado about nothing. He said some people were too focused on minor office politics instead of just pitching in where needed. He completely missed the irony of complaining about people not pitching in while he actively avoided pitching in himself. That story is over. Using office equipment constantly while never maintaining it is the workplace equivalent of eating everyone else's food and never buying groceries. The fact that he acts confused about why this bothers people just makes it worse. Some co-workers really think their convenience matters more than everyone else's time. Let's move on to a friend who thought dinner invitations came with hidden financial obligations. My friend invited me to dinner, then made me pay for everyone. I've been friends with Juliet for about 3 years, and she's always been the kind of person who likes to organise group activities. She's outgoing, social, and generally fun to be around. We usually split costs when we go out together, which has never been an issue between us. Last Friday, Juliet texted me, asking if I wanted to go to dinner at this new Italian place downtown. She said she'd been wanting to try it and thought it would be fun to catch up since we hadn't seen each other in a few weeks. I agreed and we made plans to meet there at 7. When I arrived at the restaurant, I was surprised to see that Juliet wasn't alone. She was sitting at a large table with 5 other people I recognised as her co-workers. They'd clearly been there for a while because they already had drinks and appetizers ordered. Juliet waved me over and introduced me to everyone as her friend who was joining them for dinner. I felt a little awkward being the only outsider in a group of co-workers, but everyone seemed friendly enough. They were talking about office drama and inside jokes that I couldn't really follow, but they made an effort to include me in the conversation. I figured Juliet had decided to make it a group thing last minute and just hadn't mentioned it. The dinner went well. Everyone ordered entrees, we shared a few bottles of wine, and people got dessert and coffee. The conversation was lively, and I had a good time even though I didn't know most of the people there. When the server brought the check, I expected it to be split 6 ways, since that's usually how group dinners work. Instead, Juliet looked directly at me and said, "Thanks so much for offering to treat everyone. That's so generous of you." She said it loud enough for the whole table to hear, and everyone started thanking me for paying for dinner before I could even process what was happening. I was completely confused. I hadn't offered to pay for anyone's dinner, let alone 5 people I'd never met before. I tried to clarify this with Juliet, but she just smiled and said, "Don't be modest. You said you wanted to take everyone out." I definitely had not said that. Our original plan had been for just the 2 of us to have dinner and catch up. I'd never agreed to pay for a group meal, especially not for her co-workers, who I'd just met that evening. But now I was sitting at a table with 5 people who all thought I'd volunteered to cover their meals. The check was over $200. That included everyone's entrees, multiple bottles of wine, appetizers, desserts and coffee. It was more than I'd normally spend on dining out in an entire month. I was looking at a bill that would seriously impact my budget for a dinner I hadn't even known was happening until I arrived. I pulled Juliet aside and asked her quietly what was going on. She said she'd told her co-workers that I was treating everyone as a celebration of my recent promotion at work. This was news to me on multiple levels, since I hadn't gotten a promotion and certainly hadn't offered to celebrate anything by buying dinner for strangers. When I told her I couldn't afford to pay for everyone's dinner, Juliet looked genuinely surprised. She said she'd assumed I was doing well financially, since I'd mentioned getting some overtime hours recently. She made it sound like paying for 6 people's dinner was a reasonable assumption based on me working a few extra shifts. But even if I had been flush with cash, you can't just volunteer someone else to pay for a group meal without asking them first. Juliet had essentially trapped me into either looking cheap in front of her co-workers or spending money I didn't have on people I'd just met. The worst part was that everyone at the table was still thanking me and talking about how generous I was. They had no idea that Juliet had put me in this position without my knowledge or consent. From their perspective, I'd offered to treat them to a nice dinner, and now I was trying to back out of my commitment. I ended up paying the full bill because I was too embarrassed to explain the situation in front of everyone. Juliet seemed relieved and kept talking about what a great friend I was and how much fun the evening had been. She acted like everything had gone exactly according to plan. After everyone left, I confronted Juliet about what had happened. She apologized and said she'd gotten confused about our conversation earlier in the week. She claimed she thought I'd offered to pay when I suggested going to dinner, which made no sense since I'd thought we were going as just the two of us. When I asked why she'd told her co-workers I was celebrating a promotion I didn't get, she said she'd wanted them to have a good impression of me and thought it would make me seem successful. She'd essentially created a fictional reason for me to be buying everyone dinner, then acted surprised when I couldn't live up to the story she'd invented. Juliet offered to pay me back, but she said it would have to be in installments over several months since she couldn't afford to reimburse me all at once. So not only had she volunteered me to pay for her co-workers' dinner, but she didn't even have the money to cover it herself if things had gone wrong. I haven't heard from her since that conversation 2 weeks ago. I think she's embarrassed about the whole situation, but I'm mostly just frustrated that she put me in such an uncomfortable position. Inviting someone to dinner and then ambushing them with a group meal they're expected to pay for is not something you do to a friend. That story is over. The calculated nature of this setup is what really gets to me. She created an entire fictional celebration to justify why her friend should pay for strangers' dinners, then acted confused when called out on it. Some people really will sacrifice friendships to avoid picking up their own tab. Now, let's talk about partners who think interrupting is the same as participating in conversation. My partner talks over me whenever I speak to their friends. I've been with Hugo for about 2 years now, and overall our relationship is solid. We live together, share household responsibilities, and generally communicate well when it's just the two of us. But whenever we're in social situations with his friend group, Hugo becomes a completely different person. Hugo has this tight-knit group of friends from college who all stayed in the same city after graduation. They get together regularly for dinner parties, game nights, and weekend activities. They've all known each other for over 6 years, so they have a lot of shared history and inside jokes. As the newer addition to the group, I've always felt a little like an outsider, but I've been making an effort to build relationships with them individually. The problem started becoming apparent about 8 months ago during a dinner party at one of their apartments. I was telling a story about something funny that had happened at my work, and I was maybe 30 seconds into it when Hugo jumped in and started telling the same story from his perspective. He wasn't adding details or clarifying anything. He was literally retelling my experience as if he'd been there. His friends naturally turned their attention to Hugo since he'd started speaking louder and more confidently than I had been. By the time he finished his version of my story, the conversation had moved on to something else, and I never got to finish what I'd been saying. It felt awkward to try to jump back in, so I just let it go. I thought it was a one-time thing. Maybe Hugo had gotten excited about the story and wanted to help me tell it. But then it started happening constantly. Every time I'd begin to share an opinion, tell a story, or contribute to a conversation, Hugo would interrupt me and take over whatever I'd been saying. It wasn't like he was correcting me or disagreeing with what I was saying. He would literally repeat my own thoughts and experiences back to the group as if they were his ideas. If I mentioned liking a restaurant, Hugo would jump in and give a detailed review of that same restaurant. If I started to tell a funny story about my family, Hugo would interrupt and tell the story himself, often getting details wrong because he'd only heard it from me. The most frustrating part is that his friends don't seem to notice what's happening. They're used to Hugo being the dominant voice in group conversations, so when he starts talking, everyone naturally listens to him instead of me. From their perspective, it probably just looks like Hugo is being enthusiastic and engaging. But from my perspective, it feels like Hugo doesn't think I'm capable of speaking for myself in social situations. He treats me like I need a translator or spokesperson, even when I'm perfectly capable of expressing my own thoughts and experiences. Last month we were at a game night where someone asked me about my job. I started explaining what I do for work, and Hugo immediately jumped in with his own description of my career. He wasn't just adding context, he was completely taking over the explanation. He got several details wrong and made my job sound less interesting than it actually is. But by the time he finished talking, everyone had moved on to discussing their own careers. I tried to address this with Hugo privately after that evening. I explained that when he interrupts me and retells my stories, it makes me feel like he doesn't think I can communicate effectively with his friends. I asked if he could let me finish my own thoughts before adding his perspective. Hugo seemed genuinely surprised that this bothered me. He said he was just trying to be supportive and help me feel included in group conversations. He claimed he thought he was being helpful by jumping in when he noticed I seemed nervous or unsure about what to say. But I hadn't been nervous or unsure. I'd been in the middle of normal conversations that Hugo had decided to take over. When I pointed this out, Hugo said that sometimes I talk too quietly or don't give enough context, and he was just making sure everyone could follow what I was saying. This explanation bothered me even more because it suggested that Hugo had been monitoring and judging my communication style, then deciding when I needed his intervention. He'd appointed himself as the editor of my contributions to group conversations. The pattern has continued, even after our conversation. Just last week, we were at a birthday party where someone asked me about a book I'd mentioned reading. I started to give my opinion about it, and Hugo cut me off to give his own review of the same book. The irony was that he'd never actually read it. He was just repeating things I'd told him about it in private. When I tried to clarify that those were actually my thoughts about the book, Hugo said we'd both read it and had discussed it together, so it didn't matter who shared the opinion with the group. But it did matter to me, because those were my thoughts being presented as his insights. I'm starting to dread social events with Hugo's friends, because I know I won't be able to contribute to conversations in any meaningful way. Hugo will either interrupt me or speak for me, and I'll end up feeling invisible in groups where I should be building my own relationships. The worst part is that Hugo genuinely thinks he's being helpful. He sees himself as facilitating my integration into his friend group, when actually he's preventing me from developing my own voice within that social circle. His friends are getting to know Hugo's interpretation of who I am, rather than getting to know me directly. That story is over. Being treated like you need a spokesperson in every social situation would be absolutely exhausting. He's essentially erasing her personality from group interactions while convinced he's being supportive. Some partners really think managing your social presence is part of their job description, and that's where we'll wrap up tonight's collection of stories from the depths of Reddit. These tales of workplace sabotage, friendship betrayals, and family drama remind us that sometimes the most unbelievable situations are the ones happening in real life. Whether you've been building in Minecraft while listening, or just letting these voices carry you towards sleep, I hope these stories gave you exactly what you needed tonight. Sweet dreams, everyone.